Listen, if you want another predictable romance where the brooding hero learns to smile by chapter 3, close this now. But if you're ready to watch a man who treats power like a weapon meet the one woman who refuses to flinch, then buckle up. This is the story of Duke Lucien Blackthorn, and I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand why some men don't deserve redemption. They just deserve someone strong enough to stand in the fire with them. Drop a like if you're from a city that understands what real power looks like, and comment where you're watching from. Let's begin. Winter owned the northern coast the way predators own darkness. Absolute. Patient. Merciless. The cliffs rose black and jagged from churning water, and atop them sat Blackthorn Keep, a fortress built by men who understood that survival required brutality. Duke Lucien Blackthorn stood at the highest tower window, watching storm clouds gather over the sea. He was 32 years old and had ruled Valemount for 8 years. 8 years of turning a fractured duchy into something that made even the king nervous. The servants called him the Iron Duke behind closed doors. The nobles called him worse things behind locked doors. Lucien didn't care about either. He cared about control, about the precise application of force, about making sure that every person in his territory understood exactly what happened to those who mistook his silence for weakness. His reflection stared back from the window glass. Sharp features, dark hair pulled back severe, eyes the color of winter steel, scars earned young. He looked like what he was, a man built by violence and refined by necessity. Below in the courtyard, his soldiers drilled in formation. Perfect rows, perfect timing. Lucien had inherited chaos when his father died, assassinated by rivals who thought a 19-year-old boy would crumble under pressure. They learned otherwise. 3 noble houses ceased to exist within the first year of his rule, not through public execution or dramatic warfare. They simply disappeared. Estates seized, assets frozen, family lines ended. The message spread fast. Valemount belonged to Blackthorn now, and Blackthorn didn't negotiate. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Sharp, precise, the only kind of knock Lucien tolerated. "Come in." Captain Marcus Thorne entered, his armor still bearing mud from the northern roads. Marcus had served Lucien since the beginning, had helped bury bodies in the early years when consolidating power required making examples. "Your Grace." The convoy from the capital arrived an hour ago. Lucien turned from the window. "And?" "The king's magistrate delivered the sealed documents you requested. Trade agreements with the eastern provinces. Also, the report on the Vale family investigation." Lucien moved to his desk, a massive thing carved from single piece of black oak. Everything in his office carried weight, heavy furniture, thick rugs. Weapons mounted on walls, not for decoration but for immediate access. He broke the wax seal on the report and scanned the contents. His expression never changed, but something cold settled behind his eyes. "Lord Alastair Vale is dead." Marcus nodded. "Fell from his horse 3 weeks ago, broke his neck." Lucien set the document down with deliberate care. "How convenient." "Lord Vale controlled the mountain passes. He was investigating weapons smuggling through my territory. The official report cites poor weather and bad footing, and unofficially," Marcus chose his words carefully, "6 witnesses. All servants loyal to Duke Cedric Montvale. The horse showed no signs of tampering. The magistrate ruled it accidental." Lucien walked to the large map covering his eastern wall. Valemount spread across it in detailed ink, every village and road marked. Montvale territory pressed against his southern borders like a tumor. Vale had a daughter, Lady Serafina, 24. Educated in the capital, currently residing at the family estate pending inheritance settlement. Lucien traced the mountain routes with one finger. Montvale has been expanding his influence in the passes for months. If he controls Vale's lands through marriage or proxy, he boxes me in from the south. "It's a possibility, Your Grace." "No, it's a certainty." Lucien turned back to Marcus. "Send word to Lady Serafina Vale. Offer her sanctuary at Blackthorn Keep while the inheritance is disputed. Tell her I'm investigating irregularities in her father's death." Marcus hesitated. "The king won't like you interfering in noble succession." "The king doesn't have to like it." "And Marcus? Make it clear the offer isn't optional. If Lady Vale refuses, her father's lands will be seized by Montvale within a month, and she'll end up married to whoever wants control of those mountain passes." "Understood." Marcus paused at the door. You think she knows something? Lucian returned to the window. I think her father was murdered because he knew too much, which means his daughter either has evidence or is a target. Either way, she's more valuable here than dead in some convenient accident. After Marcus left, Lucien stood alone in his war room, watching the storm approach. Power in Valemont was a game played with lives as currency. Every noble family schemed. Every alliance contained betrayal waiting to mature. Trust was a myth people told themselves before they got stabbed. Lucian had learned young. When his father died, the vultures circled immediately. Cousins who wanted his title. Lords who thought a teenager couldn't hold territory. Even his own uncle had plotted to seize control through regency. The violence that followed taught him everything he needed to know about human nature. People respected strength. They obeyed fear. Everything else was decoration. He'd spent 8 years building Valemont into something unbreakable. Trade flourished under his protection because merchants knew his roads were safe. Crime vanished because criminals learned what happened to those who stole in Blackthorn territory. Even the king's council tread carefully because Lucian controlled the northern military routes. But control required constant pressure. The moment you relaxed, the moment you showed mercy, weakness spread like infection. That's what his father had never understood. That's why his father died. Lucien had no intention of repeating that mistake. 3 days later, Lady Serafina Vale arrived at Blackthorn Keep. The afternoon had turned gray and cold, typical for the coast. Lucien watched from his tower as the carriage rolled through the main gates, escorted by a dozen of his soldiers. She hadn't come willingly. Marcus reported that it took significant persuasion and veiled threats to convince her that remaining at the Vale estate posed greater danger than accepting Blackthorn protection. Smart woman, suspicious of everyone. Lucian approved. He descended to the main hall where formal receptions occurred. The space was designed to intimidate. Soaring ceilings, stone columns, iron chandeliers hanging like weapons. Every visitor who entered understood immediately that Blackthorn Keep was not a place for comfort. Lady Serafina entered through the massive oak doors. She wore traveling clothes, black for mourning, practical rather than fashionable. Dark hair pulled back. Features that suggested aristocratic breeding, but something sharper in the eyes. She looked at Lucien the way most people didn't dare, directly. Your Grace. Her voice carried across the stone floor without hesitation. I appreciate the invitation, though I suspect it was more command than courtesy. Lucien studied her from his position near the hall's center. Most nobles approached with practiced deference, already calculating angles. Lady Vale stood her ground like someone assessing threats. Your father's death requires investigation. You're safer here while that occurs. Safe. She said the word like it tasted strange, or contained. Lucian moved closer, his boots echoing in the vast space. In my territory, those words mean the same thing. Something flickered behind her expression. Not fear, analysis. My father investigated weapons smuggling through the northern passes. 2 weeks later, he's dead. Now the Duke who controls those passes offers me sanctuary. Forgive my skepticism, Your Grace, but this feels less like protection and more like strategic positioning. The servants along the walls went very still. No one spoke to Duke Blackthorn like that, certainly not on their first meeting. Lucian stopped 3 feet from her. Your father stumbled onto something that threatened powerful interests. Those interests will eliminate anyone connected to his investigation. You can accept my protection and help me uncover the truth, or you can return home and see how long you survive. Your choice. Serafina held his gaze. And if I choose to leave, then you'll die within a month, probably in another convenient accident, and Montvale will control your family's lands by summer. Is that clear enough, Lady Vale? The silence stretched between them, broken only by wind howling against the castle walls. Finally, Serafina spoke. You govern this duchy like a battlefield. Lucian's expression never changed. Because battlefields are honest. The words hung in the cold air. Around them, servants barely breathed. Even Marcus, standing near the entrance, looked like he'd witnessed something significant. Serafina's eyes narrowed slightly. Honesty. From a man who rules through fear. Fear is the most honest currency in politics. It requires no pretense, no false promises. Everyone understands the terms immediately. How efficient. She moved past him, examining the hall with the same assessing look she'd given him. And lonely. Lucien turned to watch her. Loneliness is irrelevant. Is it? She glanced back. You've built a fortress where everyone fears you, where even your own guards move like they're walking on glass. That's not strength, Your Grace. That's isolation masquerading as control. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop. Marcus shifted position slightly, ready to intervene if needed. The servants looked anywhere except at their duke. But Lucien surprised them all. He smiled, barely, just the corner of his mouth. You have opinions. I have eyes. Serafina faced him fully. My father taught me to see past performance to structure. This keep, your reputation, your entire governing philosophy, it's designed to prevent vulnerability, which means somewhere underneath all this iron, you're afraid of something. The smile vanished. Lucien closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He didn't touch her, but his presence became oppressive, the kind of proximity that made people step back instinctively. Serafina didn't move. You know nothing about me, Lady Vale. I know you've never executed anyone publicly. She kept her voice level. You make people disappear. That's intentional. Public executions create martyrs and anger. Disappearances create uncertainty and fear. It's more sophisticated than simple brutality. Lucian's eyes went flat and cold. You should be careful making observations like that. They suggest you've studied my methods, which raises questions about your loyalties. My loyalty is to finding out who murdered my father. If that aligns with your interests, we can work together. If not, tell me now so I can leave. The hall had gone absolutely silent. Then Lucien did something he almost never did. He laughed. Short, sharp, genuine. Marcus nearly dropped his sword. You're either extraordinarily brave or catastrophically stupid, Lady Vale. I haven't decided which. Perhaps both, Your Grace. Serafina's expression remained neutral. Does that satisfy your assessment? Or should I continue proving I'm not some trembling noble who'll faint at harsh language? Lucien turned away, walking back toward the hall's center. Marcus. Show Lady Vale to the east wing. Assign her 2 guards. Rotation schedule. No one enters or laves her quarters without my authorization. He paused, glancing back. And Lady Vale? Welcome to Blackthorn Keep. I suspect you'll find it far more honest than any court you've experienced. Serafina inclined her head slightly. I suspect you're right. After she left, Marcus approached carefully. Your Grace, she's dangerous. Lucien finished. Intelligent, observant, exactly the kind of person who gets killed in situations like this. Then why bring her here? Because dangerous people make useful allies. And because if Montvale wants her dead, I want to know why badly enough to burn resources protecting her. Marcus absorbed this. You think she has evidence? I think her father trained her to think like an investigator, which means if there's evidence, she either has it or knows where to find it. Lucien moved to the staircase leading to his private chambers. Double the guard rotations. No one gets near her without clearance. And Marcus? Find out everything about Lord Vale's movements in the month before he died. Everyone he met. Everything he investigated. I want a complete picture. Understood. Lucien climbed the stairs alone, his thoughts already calculating angles. Serafina Vale was a complication. Smart enough to be dangerous, bold enough to speak truth in a place where honesty usually earned violence. Most people in her situation would have arrived grateful, desperate for protection. She'd arrived suspicious and analytical. That meant she was either a player or bait. Either way, she'd just become the most interesting piece on his board. Thus, night fell over Blackthorn Keep with its usual weight. The fortress transformed after dark, becoming something older and more primordial than simple architecture. Wind screamed through the battlements. Waves crashed against the cliffs below. Shadows moved like living things across stone corridors. Lucien stood in his private study, reviewing reports by candlelight. Sleep came rarely and briefly. He'd learned years ago that vulnerability occurred in rest, so he minimized both. A knock interrupted his reading. Enter. Marcus stepped inside, carrying additional documents. The investigation into Lord Vale's activities. He met with several magistrates in the month before his death, all concerning trade irregularities in the northern passes. Lucien scanned the papers. Irregularities meaning weapons shipments that don't match customs records, convoys traveling through Vale's mountain territory without proper documentation. Marcus hesitated. There's more. 2 of the magistrates Vale spoke with are now dead, one from illness, one from robbery. How convenient. Lucien set the documents aside. Someone's running weapons through my territory, using mountain routes I don't fully control. Vale discovered it. Now Vale's dead. His daughter's vulnerable, and Montvale positions to seize the mountain passes. It's circumstantial, Your Grace. Circumstantial evidence is still evidence. It just requires more of it. Lucien stood, moving to his map wall. If I'm right, this isn't about inheritance or family politics. This is about establishing a weapons pipeline that bypasses my authority. To what end? Lucien traced the mountain routes with one finger, following them south and west. Rebellion. Someone's supplying arms to agitators in the western provinces. If they control Vale's passes, they have a direct route that avoids my inspection points. The king would see that as treason. The king is weak and distracted by court politics. That's why this territory matters. Lucien turned from the map. I'm the only thing standing between stable trade routes and complete chaos. Remove me, and half the northern territories descend into factional warfare. Marcus absorbed this quietly. After a moment, he spoke carefully. The Lady Vale. You believe she knows about the weapons smuggling? I believe her father shared information with her before he died. Whether she understands its significance remains unclear. Lucien returned to his desk. That's why she stays here, protected, observed, until we determine exactly what she knows. And if she proves uncooperative, then we persuade her otherwise. But Marcus? Be subtle. Lady Vale responds to intelligence, not intimidation. Threats will make her defensive. Information will make her curious. Understood. Marcus moved toward the door, then paused. Your Grace, if I may. The lady spoke to you today in a manner that would have earned most people severe consequences. Your point? You tolerated it. More than tolerated. You engaged with it. Lucien's expression went carefully blank. Your observation is noted. Dismissed. After Marcus left, Lucien sat alone in the candlelight, staring at reports without reading them. Serafina Vale had done something unexpected today. She'd challenged him directly, without the usual calculations or fear management. Most nobles approached him like a dangerous animal to be managed. They smiled, flattered, maneuvered. She'd simply told him the truth as she saw it. Isolation masquerading as control. The words irritated him precisely because they contained accuracy. Lucien had built his power on certainty and fear. He'd eliminated threats systematically, created an environment where betrayal became suicidal. It worked. Valemont flourished under his governance even as everyone within it feared him. But fear was exhausting to maintain. It required constant reinforcement, constant vigilance. The moment you relaxed, the moment you showed weakness, everything collapsed. His father had shown weakness, had believed in loyalty and honor, had trusted the wrong people. His father died screaming in an ambush orchestrated by his own brother. Lucien learned the lesson permanently. Trust nothing, control everything, show no vulnerability. It kept him alive, kept Valemont stable, kept enemies distant. It also meant that every conversation was performance. Every interaction was transaction. Every relationship was strategic positioning. Lady Vale was right. It was lonely. Not that loneliness mattered, survival mattered, power mattered. Everything else was indulgence that got people killed. He returned to his reports, forcing thoughts of dark-haired women with observant eyes from his mind. Work continued, always. Across the keep, in the East Wing quarters, Serafina Vale stood at her window, watching storm clouds gather over the northern sea. The room assigned to her was comfortable but impersonal, well-furnished, clean, completely lacking any warmth. Like the Duke himself, she thought. 2 guards stood outside her door. Rotation schedule, the captain had said. No one enters or leaves without authorization. Translation, prisoner with better accommodations. Serafina wasn't surprised. She'd known accepting Blackthorn's offer meant trading one form of danger for another. But staying at the Vale estate would have been suicide. Montvale's people had already started circling, offering condolences with smiles that never reached their eyes. Her father had taught her to read people, to see past performance to motivation. Right before he died, he'd been afraid. Not panicked, calculating. Like someone who'd discovered something significant and was determining how to act on it. He'd left her a letter, hidden in his private study, tucked inside a book about northern trade routes. She'd found it 2 days after his death. The letter had been brief. Serafina, if you're reading this, I'm likely dead. I discovered weapons smuggling through our mountain passes. Evidence hidden in the East Vault. Trust no one in Montvale. Duke Blackthorn is brutal, but honorable in his way. If necessary, go to him. The North remembers its debts. She'd memorized the letter and burned it immediately. Now she stood in Blackthorn Keep, surrounded by guards, protected by a man whose reputation suggested he'd kill anyone who threatened his interests. The question was whether her father's faith in Blackthorn honor was justified or terminal naivety. Duke Lucien Blackthorn was exactly what rumors suggested: dangerous, calculating, utterly devoid of warmth. He governed through fear because fear worked. Simple, efficient, brutal. But something in their conversation today had surprised her. When she'd challenged him, he hadn't responded with anger or threats. He'd engaged, tested her, almost seemed amused by her boldness, which meant he was more complex than his reputation suggested, or more skilled at manipulation. Serafina turned from the window, assessing her surroundings with practiced observation. The room had been searched before her arrival. Subtle signs: books slightly misaligned, drawer handles positioned wrong, furniture showing faint disturbance in dust patterns. Thorough. Professional. Exactly what she'd expect from someone who survived through absolute control. She moved to the desk and withdrew paper and ink. If she was going to be trapped here, she might as well use the time productively. Her father's letter mentioned evidence in the East Vault. She needed to determine if that vault was at the Vale estate or hidden elsewhere. Needed to understand the weapons smuggling network he'd discovered. And she needed to figure out if Duke Blackthorn was potential ally or ultimate threat. The storm broke that night with typical coastal violence. Thunder shook the castle walls. Lightning illuminated the keep in stark flashes. Rain hammered against stone like nature declaring war. Serafina lay awake, listening to the chaos outside. Around midnight, she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not guards. Different rhythm. Someone moving with authority rather than patrol routine. She rose silently, moving to her door. The footsteps paused outside her room, then continued past. Serafina waited several minutes before opening her door quietly. The corridor was empty except for her two guards, both facing away, watching the main approach. She stepped back inside, mind working. Someone had walked past her room deliberately. Someone who moved like they owned the space completely. The Duke, checking on her personally rather than trusting reports, which meant he considered her significant enough to monitor directly. Serafina smiled grimly in the darkness. Good. Significant people had leverage, had value. She'd spent her entire life watching her father navigate noble politics, watching powerful men maneuver for advantage while pretending friendship. She'd learned the dance young: smile, defer, observe. But Duke Blackthorn didn't respond to performance. He responded to honesty. So she'd give him honesty. Direct, challenging, the kind of interaction he clearly never experienced. Make herself useful enough to trust, dangerous enough to respect, and hope that her father's faith in Blackthorn honor proved accurate, because if it didn't, she was trapped in a fortress with a man who made people disappear, and no one outside these walls knew or cared if she lived or died. The storm raged through the night, and inside Blackthorn Keep, two dangerous people began a game neither fully understood. What they both failed to realize was that the real threat was already moving. Miles south, in Montvale territory, Duke Cedric Montvale stood in his private chambers, reading reports about Lady Serafina Vale's arrival at Blackthorn Keep. His expression remained pleasant, calculated. He set the report aside and spoke to the shadows. Blackthorn thinks he's protecting a useful asset. Show him what happens when he interferes with my plans. Make it clear that Lady Vale belongs to me, one way or another. A figure emerged from darkness, silent, professional. Understood, Your Grace. When? Montvale smiled. Give it 3 days. Let them feel safe first. Then remind Duke Blackthorn that some women aren't worth the war they'll cost him. The figure vanished like smoke. Montvale returned to his window, watching storm clouds gather. Lucien Blackthorn had ruled through fear for 8 years, built an impenetrable reputation, made himself untouchable. But everyone had weaknesses. Everyone protected something. And Cedric Montvale specialized in finding those weaknesses and destroying them systematically. Let the Iron Duke think he'd secured a valuable piece. Let him invest resources protecting her. Then take her away and watch his perfect control shatter. The game was just beginning, and by the time Blackthorn realized he was playing, it would already be far too late. 3 days of false peace followed. Serafina spent her mornings in the castle library, a vast room filled with books nobody read anymore. Dust covered most surfaces. The collection focused on military history and territorial law, exactly what you'd expect from a man who treated governance like prolonged warfare. She found what she was looking for on the second day. Shipping manifests from the northern passes dating back 18 months. Public records, technically, but buried deep enough that most people wouldn't bother looking. Her father had been right. The numbers didn't match. Weapons shipments listed at customs didn't correspond with actual deliveries. Entire convoys appeared in Vale territory records, but vanished from official logs before reaching their stated destinations. Someone was diverting military-grade arms through the mountains, and they'd gotten sloppy enough that her father noticed. Serafina copied the discrepancies carefully, noting dates and quantities. Evidence. Real evidence. The kind that could bring down noble houses if presented correctly. The question remained, who benefited from illegal weapons moving through Vale territory into regions where rebellion simmered constantly? She looked up from her notes to find Duke Blackthorn standing in the library doorway. He moved without sound. That was the first thing you noticed about him once you paid attention. For a man his size, he displaced air like he'd learned to make even his presence tactical. Your Grace. She didn't stand, didn't perform deference. That dance was already established between them. Lady Vale. Lucy Yen entered the library, examining the books she'd pulled. Northern trade records, customs documentation. Interesting reading. I find numbers more honest than people. He almost smiled. We agree on something. Serafina closed her notebook. My father kept meticulous records. He believed documentation protected against lies. Past tense. Lucien moved closer, studying the spines of books surrounding her research station. Did it protect him? No. But it might protect me. Silence settled between them. Outside, wind howled against the castle walls. The library felt carved from winter itself, all stone and cold light. Lucien spoke without looking at her. You found discrepancies in the weapons shipments. It wasn't a question. Serafina met his eyes. Yes. And you think those discrepancies got your father killed? I think my father discovered someone was running an illegal arms network through territory he controlled. I think that someone had him murdered before he could expose them. And I think you already suspected this before you brought me here. Lucien turned fully toward her. His expression revealed nothing, but something shifted in his eyes. Calculation. Reassessment. What gave me away? You didn't question my arrival with suspicion. You expected it. Serafina leaned back in her chair. You knew my father was investigating something significant. You wanted to see if I had evidence before Montvale or whoever else was involved made me disappear. Smart. Lucien pulled out a chair and sat across from her, an unexpected gesture. Most of their interactions occurred standing, maintaining formal distance. That means you understand why you're here. I'm bait. Evidence, leverage, possibly all three, and yet you came anyway. Serafina held his gaze, because staying at the Vale estate meant dying quietly while pretending everything was fine. At least here, I'm a useful prisoner. You're not a prisoner. Then I'm free to leave? Lucien's expression didn't change. You're free to die stupidly if you prefer. I won't stop you. How generous. Something flickered across his face. Almost amusement. Almost. He leaned forward slightly. Tell me what you found. Serafina hesitated. This was the moment. The point where she either became his asset or remained his captive. Information was currency. Once spent, it couldn't be reclaimed. But keeping it served no purpose except pride. She opened her notebook. Over the last 18 months, approximately 40 weapon shipments entered Vale territory through the northern customs houses. Official records show 32 reaching their stated destinations. 8 convoys simply vanished from documentation after clearing my father's checkpoints. Where did they go? That's what my father tried to determine. Serafina traced the dates with one finger. He started requesting additional documentation from the magistrates who approved the shipments, asking questions about escort details and final delivery confirmations. And then he died. Lucien absorbed the information with visible focus. How much weaponry are we discussing? Enough to arm a small military force. Swords, pikes, crossbows. Nothing modern, but sufficient for insurrection if distributed to organized groups. The western provinces. Lucien stood abruptly, moving to the window. There's been unrest building for years. Peasant uprisings. Merchant guild protests. Nothing coordinated yet, but all it needs is organization and weapons. Someone's providing both. Yes. Lucian stared out at the gray sky. And someone with authority had to approve those shipments through customs. Someone who benefits from destabilizing this region. Serafina joined him at the window. Montvale. Lucian glanced at her. Why Montvale specifically? Process of elimination. My father's death benefits whoever wants control of the mountain passes. Montvale territory borders those passes. If rebellion breaks out in the western provinces, the king will need military response. That means troop movements through territory Montvale, controls if he secures Vale lands. Lucian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, which gives him leverage over both the king and me. If he controls supply routes during conflict, he becomes indispensable. And if I try to intervene, I'm interfering with royal military operations. Serafina watched him process the implications. This wasn't simple murder for inheritance. This was positioning for long-term power. What will you do? Lucian turned from the window. What I always do. Control what can be controlled. Eliminate what can't. By which you mean? By which I mean Montvale just made this personal. Lucian moved toward the library door, then paused. Lady Vale, you should know that finding this evidence makes you exponentially more dangerous to keep alive. Montvale will escalate. I assumed as much. And you're not afraid? Serafina met his eyes directly. I stopped being afraid the moment my father died. Fear is a luxury I can't afford anymore. Something passed across Lucien's expression. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. Good. Fear makes people predictable. He left without another word, his footsteps fading into the stone corridors. Serafina remained at the window, watching storm clouds gather. She'd just committed fully. Shown her hand. Made herself either invaluable or expendable depending on how Blackthorn calculated value. But staying silent would have been slower suicide. At least now she was playing the game instead of being played. That evening, Lucien called his senior advisors to the war room. Captain Marcus Thorne arrived first, followed by Steward Garrett and Magistrate Olwyn. The three men who helped Lucien consolidate power 8 years ago and had survived through competence and absolute loyalty. They gathered around the massive table dominating the room's center. Maps covered every surface. Reports stacked in careful piles. This was where Valamont got governed when theater wasn't required. Lucian stood at the table's head, hands braced against the wood. Montvale is running weapons to rebel groups in the western provinces. He murdered Lord Vale to secure the mountain pass routes. He plans to leverage the coming conflict for power over both the king and our territory. The three men absorbed this without visible surprise. They'd worked with Lucian long enough to expect calculated accusations backed by evidence. Marcus spoke first. Proof? Lady Vale found shipping discrepancies dating back 18 months. 8 military convoys disappeared from documentation after entering Vale territory. Her father started investigating before his convenient accident. Steward Garrett frowned. 8 convoys is sufficient material for sustained insurrection. If Montvale's supplying organized resistance, he's committing treason while positioning himself as indispensable to stopping it. Lucien traced the mountain routes on the map. Classic misdirection. Create the problem, offer the solution. Consolidate power during the chaos. Magistrate Olwyn adjusted his spectacles. We need incontrovertible evidence before accusing another duke of treason, especially to the king. I don't plan to involve the king. Lucien's tone carried absolute finality. The king is weak, and his counsel is compromised. By the time royal investigations conclude, Montvale will control half the north. Then what's your play, Your Grace? Marcus leaned over the map, reading terrain like text. Lucien was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of cold certainty that made men nervous. We force Montvale to reveal himself, make him escalate before he's ready. Panic creates mistakes. Mistakes create vulnerability. How do we force escalation? Garrett asked carefully. By keeping Lady Vale alive and protected. Lucien straightened. She's evidence he can't afford to exist. Every day she survives makes him more desperate. Eventually he'll send people to eliminate her. You're using her as bait. Marcus's expression revealed nothing, but his tone carried weight. I'm using her as pressure. There's a difference. Lucien met his captain's gaze. Bait gets sacrificed. Pressure gets protected while it works. The distinction seemed thin to Marcus, but he didn't argue. Your Grace, if Montvale sends assassins, he will. It's inevitable. Lucian moved to the window overlooking the courtyard. Triple her guard rotation. No one approaches her quarters without verification. And Marcus, I want your best men. Not adequate. Best. Understood. Marcus made notes. What about the lady herself? Does she know she's the catalyst? She's intelligent. She's already figured it out. Lucian watched soldiers drilling below. That's why I told her directly. Pretending otherwise would have been insult. Steward Garrett cleared his throat. Your Grace, forgive the observation, but you seem unusually invested in Lady Vale's survival beyond strategic value. The room went very quiet. Lucian turned slowly from the window. Your point, Garrett? No point, Your Grace. Simple observation. Lucian's eyes went flat and cold in the way that made survival instincts scream warnings. Lady Vale is valuable evidence in exposing treason that threatens this territory. I protect valuable assets. That's governance, not sentiment. Are we clear? Perfectly, Your Grace. Good. Lucien returned to the table. Now, Montvale will need to move within the week. The longer Lady Vale remains secure, the more his position deteriorates. We need countermeasures in place before he acts. They spent the next hour planning defensive protocols, guard rotations, supply chain security, communication networks, everything required to transform Blackthorn Keep from fortress into absolute stronghold. By the time the meeting concluded, the sun had set completely. Winter darkness swallowed the castle. Marcus lingered after the others left. Permission to speak freely, Your Grace? Lucien looked up from his maps. Granted. The lady challenged you in the Great Hall 3 days ago, in front of servants. That's unprecedented. Marcus chose words carefully. Yet you not only tolerated it, you engaged with her, treated her observations with respect rather than punishment. Lucian's expression revealed nothing. Your point? You don't do that. You never do that. Marcus met his commander's eyes directly. Everyone else who speaks to you that way ends up disappeared or broken. But her? You almost seem to enjoy the confrontation. Lucien set down the document he'd been holding. Lady Vale is different from court sycophants. She doesn't perform, doesn't calculate angles before speaking. That's rare enough to be valuable. Valuable? Yes. The silence stretched. Finally, Marcus spoke again, quietly. Your Grace, I've served you for 8 years. Watched you build this territory through absolute control and calculated violence. You don't form attachments. You don't show favoritism. That's what makes you effective. And your concern is? My concern is that Lady Vale is getting under your defenses, and you're rationalizing it as strategy. Marcus's tone carried no judgment, only observation. I've never seen you check on someone personally at midnight. I've never seen you sit across from anyone the way you sat with her in the library. Lucian's jaw tightened. You're dismissed, Captain. Marcus bowed. Your Grace. After he left, Lucian stood alone in the war room, staring at maps that suddenly seemed irrelevant. Marcus was wrong. Had to be wrong. Serafina Vale was valuable evidence. A means to expose Montvale and prevent territorial destabilization. That's why he protected her. Why he spent time ensuring she understood her position. Why he found her intelligence refreshing after years of navigating nobles who treated conversation like warfare. Nothing more. The alternative was unacceptable. Attachments created vulnerability. Vulnerability invited destruction. That's what his father never understood. That's why his father died screaming. Lucien had built 8 years of absolute power by eliminating every potential weakness, by ensuring no one and nothing could be used against him. He would not compromise that foundation for a dark-haired woman with sharp observations and eyes that didn't flinch. Would not. But even as he thought it, he knew Marcus had identified something true, something dangerous, something that could destroy everything if he didn't control it immediately. Lucien extinguished the candles and left the war room in darkness. Control. That was the answer. Control the situation, control the threat, control himself. Failure was not optional. Midnight brought the attack. Serafina woke to the sound of steel on steel echoing through stone corridors. Her guards were fighting something outside her door. She rolled from bed instantly, grabbing the small blade she'd hidden under her mattress. Not much. Barely a weapon. But better than nothing. The fighting intensified. Shouts, crashes, the wet sound of blade meeting flesh. Then silence. Serafina pressed herself against the wall beside the door, knife ready, breathing controlled. The door exploded inward. Two men entered dressed in dark clothing, faces covered, professional, moving with coordinated precision. The first one saw her and moved fast. Serafina dodged left, slashing with her small blade. She caught his forearm, drawing blood but not stopping momentum. He grabbed her wrist, twisting hard. Pain shot through her arm. The knife clattered to the floor. The second attacker moved behind her, catching her other arm. They had her. Then the room's second door, the one leading to the private corridor, crashed open. Duke Blackthorn entered like violence given human form. He wasn't wearing armor, wasn't prepared. Just dark clothing and the kind of cold rage that made the temperature drop. The first attacker released Serafina and drew his sword. Mistake. Lucien closed the distance before the blade finished clearing its sheath. His elbow struck the man's throat with surgical precision. Bone crunched. The attacker went down, choking. The second man still held Serafina. He pressed a blade against her neck. "Let us leave, or she dies." Lucien stopped, absolutely still. His eyes met Serafina's across the room. For one moment, something passed between them. Understanding, trust, decision. Then Serafina drove her heel down hard on her captor's instep while simultaneously throwing her weight backward. The blade moved away from her throat by inches. Just enough. Lucien moved. He crossed the space in 2 strides, caught the attacker's wrist, twisted with brutal efficiency. The man screamed as bones snapped. The blade fell. Lucien caught it midair and drove it through the man's chest in one smooth motion. The attacker collapsed. Silence crashed over the room. Serafina stood breathing hard, blood on her nightgown from the close blade work. Not her blood. Lucien examined her with clinical focus, checking for injuries without touching her. "You're hurt?" "No." Her voice came steadier than expected. They didn't get that far. "Good." Lucien moved to the door where her guards lay dead. Professional work. They killed trained soldiers without raising alarm until it was too late. Montvale's people? Obviously. Lucien studied the dead attackers. He moved faster than I expected. That's concerning. Concerning? Serafina almost laughed. We just killed 2 assassins in my bedroom, and you're concerned about timing. Lucien glanced at her. If he's this desperate this quickly, his position is weaker than I calculated, which means he's more dangerous, not less. Footsteps thundered in the corridor. Marcus arrived with 12 soldiers, weapons drawn. He assessed the scene instantly. Your Grace. Lady Vale, secure this wing. Lucien's voice carried absolute command. Find out how they breached the keep. Someone help them. I want names. Marcus saluted and began barking orders. Lucien finally looked directly at Serafina. Get dressed. You're moving to the North Tower. My private quarters. No one enters that section without my direct authorization. Your quarters? Serafina's eyebrow rose despite the circumstances. That seems necessary. Lucien cut her off. These men got through triple guard rotation and locked doors. That shouldn't be possible, which means either someone inside helped them or our security is compromised at structural levels. Either way, you're not safe in the guest wing anymore. And I'm safer sleeping near you. Something flickered in his eyes. Something that made her pulse jump for reasons unrelated to the assassination attempt. You're safer in a location where betrayal equals instant death for everyone involved. My personal guards know that failing to protect my quarters means their families suffer. That kind of motivation creates reliability. How reassuring. But Serafina didn't argue. He was right. The attack proved that conventional security wasn't sufficient. Lucien moved toward the door. 10 minutes. Then Marcus escorts you. Bring nothing except what you're wearing. Why nothing? Because anything in this room could be tracked or marked. Fresh start. Fresh location. No compromises. He left without waiting for a response. Serafina stood in her ruined bedroom, surrounded by corpses and blood, and realized the game had just changed completely. This wasn't strategic positioning anymore. This was survival. Raw and immediate. And Duke Lucien Blackthorn had just put himself between her and everyone who wanted her dead. The question that kept her awake for the rest of that night was simple and terrifying. Why? Strategic value didn't explain checking on prisoners personally at midnight. Didn't explain the cold rage in his eyes when that blade touched her throat. Didn't explain moving her into his private quarters where proximity would fuel every scandal in Valemont. Something had shifted between them. Something neither acknowledged, but both felt. Something dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with assassins or treason. Serafina dressed quickly, her hands steady despite the adrenaline still flooding her system. Whatever was happening, whatever complicated web they were both caught in, one thing had become absolutely clear. Duke Blackthorn would burn Valemont to the ground before letting anyone take her. And that reality was either salvation or damnation. She wasn't sure which. But morning was coming, and with it, war. Because Montvale had just made his move, and Lucian Blackthorn never forgave attacks on things he'd claimed as his own. The North Tower rose higher than any other part of Blackthorn Keep, a stone finger pointing at hostile skies. Marcus led Serafina through corridors she'd never seen, each level more restricted than the last. They climbed stairs worn smooth by centuries of use. No servants worked here. No guards stood at regular posts, just emptiness and cold stone. Finally, they reached a heavy iron door. Marcus unlocked it with a key that probably only 3 people in the entire fortress possessed. The Duke's private quarters. He stepped aside. No one enters without his direct order. That includes me. Serafina entered. The space surprised her. She'd expected something harsh and utilitarian. Instead, she found a large room dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the northern sea. Books everywhere, actually read based on wear patterns. A desk covered in reports and maps. Weapons mounted on walls within easy reach, yes, but also evidence of someone who lived here, not just survived. One detail caught her attention immediately. A portrait above the fireplace showing a younger man who shared Lucian's features. Same sharp bone structure, same intense eyes. But this man smiled. His father had to be. The man whose murder taught Lucian that trust was fatal. She heard the door close behind Marcus, heard the lock engage. Alone now. In the most private space of the most dangerous man in Valemont, Serafina moved to the windows. Dawn was breaking over the sea, painting the water in shades of gray and silver. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Behind her, the door opened. Lucian entered, still wearing the dark clothing from earlier, now stained with blood that wasn't his. He moved to the desk without acknowledging her presence, reviewing documents with focused intensity. Several minutes passed in silence. Finally, Serafina spoke. "Thank you. For earlier." Lucian didn't look up. "I was protecting valuable evidence. Is that what I am?" "Yes." "Nothing else?" His hand stopped moving. He set down the document carefully. Very carefully. Then he looked at her directly. "What do you want me to say, Lady Vale? That I find your intelligence refreshing? That I respect your refusal to perform the usual noble theater? That having someone speak truth without calculation is novel enough to be compelling? Would any of that be true?" Lucian stood, moving toward the windows where she stood. He stopped close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, close enough to be deliberately intimate. All of it would be true, which is precisely why it's irrelevant. Why irrelevant? Because attachments create vulnerability. Vulnerability invites destruction. I learned that watching my father die, screaming because he trusted the wrong person. His voice remained level, but something cold lived in it. Some old wound that never healed. So yes, Lady Vale, your evidence, your strategic value, your leverage against enemies who want you dead, that's what you can be, because anything else gets us both killed. Serafina held his gaze. "You're afraid." Lucien's expression went flat and dangerous. "Excuse me? You're afraid. Not of Montvale. Not of assassination attempts. You're afraid of what happens if you let yourself care about someone again. So you rationalize protection as strategy and interest as utility." She stepped closer, matching his intensity. "But that blade against my throat made you angry in a way that had nothing to do with protecting evidence." The silence between them became suffocating. When Lucien spoke, his voice came quiet and absolutely lethal. "You should be very careful making observations like that." "Or what? You'll make me disappear? Lock me in your tower? Oh, wait." Serafina gestured at the room around them. "Already done." Something cracked in Lucien's control. His hand came up, catching her jaw not roughly but with clear possession, making her look directly at him. "You don't understand what you're asking for." "I am not a good man, Serafina. I've done things that would make you sick. I've destroyed people for the crime of existing inconveniently. Everything soft in me died the same night my father did. Then why are your hands shaking? They were, barely, but enough to notice. Lucien stared at her like she'd become a problem he couldn't solve through usual methods. Like his entire framework for understanding control had just fractured. His thumb traced her jawline once, almost tender, almost gentle. Then he released her and stepped back. Get some sleep. You're safe here. His voice returned to its normal, cold command. I have work to do. He left through a connecting door she hadn't noticed, leaving her alone in his private space. Serafina stood at the window, watching the sun rise over hostile water, and understood with absolute certainty they'd both just crossed a line neither could uncross. The game had changed, and war was coming whether either of them was ready or not. Miles south, Duke Cedric Montvale received news of the failed assassination with controlled fury. 2 of his best operatives, dead, and the girl still alive, now protected so thoroughly that another attempt would be near impossible. Worse, Blackthorn would know the attack came from him, would be calculating retaliation. This was escalating faster than planned. Montvale stood in his war room, studying maps by candlelight. He'd spent 3 years building the weapons network, positioning pieces, creating the conditions for profitable chaos. Blackthorn should have been manageable, should have followed protocol and referred the Vale situation to royal investigators, should have stayed in his lane. Instead, he'd taken the girl, protected her, and now actively stood between Montvale and the mountain passes necessary for everything to work. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter. His advisor, Lord Brennan, stepped inside. Your Grace, our sources confirm Lady Vale has been moved to Blackthorn's private tower. Security is now absolute. Then we adjust strategy. Montvale returned to his desk. If we can't eliminate the girl, we eliminate Blackthorn's ability to protect her. How? Montvale smiled without warmth. The Western Rebellion is nearly ready. We've supplied enough weapons for initial uprising. If we accelerate the timeline, force open conflict in the provinces, the king will demand military intervention. Blackthorn won't leave Valamont during a crisis. He will if the king orders it, and once he's committed to suppressing rebellion in the west, his keep becomes vulnerable. Montvale traced supply routes on the map. We take Vale territory while he's gone. Secure the passes. By the time he returns, it's accomplished fact. And Lady Vale stays locked in Blackthorn Keep, isolated, useless. Montvale's expression hardened. Let the Iron Duke keep his pet. Without the Vale lands, she's just another noble with no power and no options. Brennan absorbed this. When do we trigger the uprising? Montvale considered timing carefully. 3 days. Give Blackthorn just enough time to think he's secured the situation, then chaos. And if he refuses the king's order to intervene, then he's guilty of insubordination during crisis. Either way, we win. Montvale returned to studying maps, already calculating angles. The Iron Duke thinks he's fighting me for one woman. He doesn't see the real game, which is control of the North, complete control. And by the time Blackthorn realizes what he's lost trying to protect her, it will be far too late to stop me. The pieces were moving, the trap was set, and Duke Lucien Blackthorn, the man who controlled everything through fear and absolute power, was about to discover that some battles couldn't be won by force alone. Dawn broke cold over Blackthorn Keep, painting the fortress in shades of iron and ash. Serafina woke in an unfamiliar bed, disoriented for 3 seconds before memory crashed back. The assassination attempt. The bodies. Lucian's hands shaking against her face. She was in his private tower now, in the most secure location in Valamont, protected by a man who claimed she was nothing more than strategic evidence while looking at her like she'd become the one variable he couldn't control. The connecting door opened without warning. Lucian entered carrying documents, already dressed for war in dark leather and steel. He didn't look like he'd slept. Probably hadn't. We need to talk. His voice carried the flat tone that meant serious tactical discussion. Get dressed. War room in 10 minutes. He left before she could respond. Serafina rose quickly, finding clothing laid out that actually fit her. Someone had prepared this, planned this. She dressed in practical dark fabric, suitable for a fortress preparing for siege rather than a lady preparing for court. 8 minutes later, she descended to the war room. The space was already crowded. Captain Marcus stood near the large map table, along with Steward Garrett and Magistrate Olwyn. Several military officers she didn't recognize filled the remaining space, all men hardened by years under Blackthorn command. They fell silent when she entered. Lucienne stood at the table's head, hands braced on wood scarred by decades of strategic planning. Lady Vale, join us. Serafina moved to the table, acutely aware of every eye tracking her movement. She was the only woman present, the only person without military rank or administrative authority. Her presence here was statement and provocation both. Lucian didn't waste time on pleasantries. 3 hours ago, rebellion erupted in the western provinces, coordinated attacks on 4 garrison towns simultaneously. Casualty reports are still coming in, but preliminary numbers suggest organized military action, not spontaneous uprising. Marcus placed markers on the map, showing affected locations. The pattern is deliberate, Your Grace. They hit supply depots and communication outposts first. Someone with tactical training planned this. Someone with access to military-grade weapons. Lucian's gaze moved to Serafina. The same weapons that disappeared through Vale territory over the last 18 months. Understanding settled cold in her stomach. Montvale triggered the rebellion. Obviously. Lucian traced supply routes with one finger. He accelerated his timeline after last night's failed assassination. Now the king is demanding military response, which means committing forces to the western territories, leaving Valamont vulnerable. Magistrate Olwyn adjusted his spectacles nervously. Your Grace, if you deploy troops west, Montvale can move on Vale lands unopposed. Exactly. Lucian straightened. Which is why I'm refusing the king's order. The room went absolutely silent. Even Marcus looked shocked. Steward Garrett spoke carefully. Your Grace, refusing a direct royal command during active rebellion is treason. The king could strip your title, seize your lands, execute you for insubordination. Lucien's expression never changed. Let him try. My military controls the northern routes. My treasury funds half the kingdom's trade infrastructure. The king needs me more than I need his approval. He'll bluster and threaten, but he won't move against me. Not while rebellion rages and he requires my resources. This is madness. One of the military officers, a colonel whose name Serafina didn't know, stepped forward. You're risking everything over territorial dispute and one woman. Lucian turned slowly toward the colonel. His eyes went flat and cold. I'm risking nothing. I'm making a tactical decision based on threat assessment. Montvale engineered this rebellion specifically to divide my attention and resources. Deploying west plays directly into his strategy. So instead, I'm securing what matters and letting the king's own forces handle the uprising they should have prevented. The colonel looked like he wanted to argue further, but survival instinct won. He stepped back. Marcus spoke into the tense silence. Your Grace, what are your orders? Full defensive posture. Lucienne returned to the map. Triple border patrols along Montvale territory. Secure all mountain passes leading to Vale lands. Recall the northern garrison to reinforce the keep. And Marcus, send word to every lord in Valamont. Anyone who sides with Montvale or attempts to exploit this situation will face immediate and permanent consequences. Understood. Marcus began making notes. Lucien's gaze swept the assembled officers. I know some of you question this decision. Think I'm prioritizing personal interest over duty. His voice carried absolute command. You're wrong. Montvale created this entire situation to seize control of territory that threatens our security. The rebellion is symptom, not disease. We treat the actual threat, not the distraction. He let that settle. Now get to work. I want defensive positions fortified by sunset. Dismissed. The officers filed out quickly, grateful to escape the tension. Only Marcus, Garrett, and Serafina remained. Garrett cleared his throat. Your Grace, the political consequences of defying the king will be handled when necessary. Lucienne cut him off. Focus on logistics, supply chains, communication networks. Make sure every weak point is secured. Garrett bowed and left. Marcus lingered, studying his commander with visible concern. Your Grace, this is the most dangerous political position you've ever taken. If Montvale moves while you're committed here, and the rebellion spreads, the entire northern territory could collapse. Then we'd better make sure Montvale doesn't move. Lucian met his captain's eyes. Do you trust me, Marcus? With my life. Always. Good. Because everything we've built for 8 years comes down to the next few days. Either we break Montvale's play completely, or we lose everything trying. Marcus nodded slowly. For what it's worth, Your Grace, I think you're making the right tactical call. Even if the reasoning behind it is complicated, there's nothing complicated about preventing territorial destabilization. Marcus almost smiled. Of course, Your Grace. He left, closing the door behind him. Serafina and Lucian stood alone in the war room. The silence stretched until she couldn't bear it. You just committed treason for me. Lucien didn't look at her. I committed tactical necessity for Valamont. Don't. Serafina moved closer. Don't pretend this is pure strategy. You could have deployed half your forces west to satisfy the king while maintaining defensive positions here. You chose absolute refusal. Because half measures lose wars. Because you're afraid if you leave, I'll be dead when you return. She forced him to look at her. That's what this is really about. Lucien's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. Then explain it to me. Make me understand why a man who spent 8 years building absolute power through fear and control is suddenly risking everything for one person. The words hung between them like drawn blades. When Lucien finally spoke, his voice came quiet and raw. My father was a good man, believed in honor, loyalty, justice. All the noble virtues that sound impressive in ballads. He trusted people, formed alliances based on mutual respect, thought that goodness created goodness. He moved to the window overlooking the courtyard. I was 19 when his brother, my uncle, orchestrated his assassination, hired mercenaries, planned it for months. My father never suspected because trust made him blind. He died screaming my name while men he'd protected and elevated murdered him in his own hall. Serafina listened without interruption. I learned that night that power without fear is suicide, that trust is weakness wearing a civilized mask, that the only way to survive is to make everyone too afraid to betray you. Lucian's hands gripped the window frame. I built Valamont into something unbreakable by eliminating every vulnerability, every potential weakness, every person who made me feel anything except calculation. He turned to face her. Then you arrived, challenging me in my own hall, speaking truth when everyone else performs theater, looking at me like I'm human instead of weapon. His expression revealed fractures and usually impenetrable control. You're the first vulnerability I've allowed in 8 years. And last night, when that blade touched your throat, I understood that Montvale had already won, because I'd do anything, sacrifice anything, destroy anything to keep you alive. That's not strategy. That's catastrophic weakness. The admission hung in the air like confession and condemnation both. Serafina crossed the space between them slowly. Maybe weakness is just another word for having something worth protecting. Lucien's laugh came bitter. Pretty philosophy. Doesn't change reality. Weakness gets people killed. So does isolation. Serafina stopped directly in front of him. You've spent 8 years making sure no one could hurt you. And you're right. No one can. But you're also completely alone in a fortress surrounded by people who fear you but don't know you. Is that really survival, or is it just slower dying? His hand came up, catching her face like before. Possessive. Claiming, you're going to get me killed, maybe. Her voice stayed steady. Or maybe I'm the only thing keeping you human enough to know why you're fighting. The distance between them evaporated. Lucien kissed her like drowning, like she was air and he'd been suffocating for years. Not gentle, not careful, desperate, and claiming and absolutely inevitable. Serafina responded with equal intensity, understanding they'd both just crossed a line that would reshape everything. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Lucien pressed his forehead to hers. This doesn't change anything strategic. You're still evidence, still leverage, still the key to exposing Montvale. Of course. But if anyone touches you again, I will burn this kingdom to ash. I know. The moment shattered when rapid footsteps echoed in the corridor. Marcus burst through the door, expression grim. Your Grace, urgent news from the southern border. Lucien straightens immediately, commander returning. Report. Montvale forces are mobilizing. 3 battalions moving toward Vale territory. Marcus placed markers on the map. He's making his move now, while the king is distracted by Western rebellion. How long until they reach Vale lands? 36 hours at current pace. Lucien studied the map with absolute focus. We intercept here. He pointed to a mountain pass. Narrow approach. Defensible terrain. Force them into ground where superior numbers become liability. That's still 2 battalions against our available forces, Marcus cautioned. The numbers aren't favorable. Numbers are irrelevant if we control the terrain. Lucien began calculating logistics. Pull the northern garrison, strip the coastal defenses. Everything we have goes to that pass. We hold it or we lose everything. Your Grace, that leaves the keep dangerously undermanned. Then we'd better win quickly. Lucien turned to Marcus. How soon can we march? 4 hours for full mobilization. 3. We don't have 4. Lucien moved toward the door, already issuing commands. Alert the officers. Full combat deployment. And Marcus, I want the absolute best defensive squad remaining at the keep. 20 men, elite only, to protect Lady Vale, to protect my home. Lucien glanced back at Serafina. She's part of that now. After Marcus left to execute orders, Serafina spoke quietly. You're leaving me here. I'm defending what's mine. Lucien returned to face her. You'll be safe. 20 elite guards who know their families die if they fail. You're more protected here than anywhere else in Valemont. Unless you lose. I don't lose. Everyone loses eventually. Lucien caught her face between both hands, forcing absolute attention. Listen carefully. If something happens, if I don't come back, there's a sealed document in my desk. Top drawer. It contains everything you need. Evidence of Montvale's treason, safe passage documents, letters of credit. Take it and run. Get to the capital. Present it directly to the King's Council. Lucien, promise me. His intensity turned almost violent. Promise me that if I fall, you survive. That's non-negotiable. Serafina held his gaze. I promise. Good. He kissed her once more, brief and claiming. Stay alive. That's an order. Then he was gone, striding through corridors, issuing commands, transforming from man to weapon in the space of heartbeats. Serafina stood alone in the war room, listening to the fortress mobilize around her. 3 hours later, she watched from the tower window as Lucien led his army through the gates. Dark armor, black banners, moving with the coordinated precision that made Blackthorn forces legendary. He didn't look back. The gates closed behind the last soldier with the finality of tomb sealing. Silence crashed over the keep. Serafina counted the guards Lucien left behind. 20 men positioned at strategic points. Elite soldiers whose eyes never stopped scanning for threats. She should feel safe, protected, secured by the best defensive squad in the north. Instead, she felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. Something was wrong. She couldn't articulate why. Just instinct screaming warnings her rational mind couldn't process. She descended to Lucien's study, retrieving the sealed document he'd mentioned, broke the wax. Read contents that detailed Montvale's entire conspiracy with documentation that would destroy him completely. Evidence. Real evidence. Everything they needed. So why did it feel like trap? Night fell over the fortress with oppressive weight. Serafina ate dinner alone in the tower, watching darkness swallow the horizon. The guards changed shifts with military precision. Everything appeared normal. That's what made her nervous. Normal was illusion in places where power played with lives. Around midnight, she heard footsteps approaching the tower. Not guard rotation. Wrong rhythm. Multiple people moving with coordinated purpose. Serafina stood, moving toward the door with growing dread. It opened before she reached it. Captain Marcus entered, flanked by 4 guards she didn't recognize. His expression carried something she'd never seen before. Guilt. Lady Vale. His voice came flat. You need to come with us. Understanding hit like physical blow. No. Marcus avoided her eyes. I'm sorry. Truly. But orders are orders. Lucien's orders? Different orders. Marcus gestured to the guards. She comes quietly or not? Your choice. Serafina's mind raced through options. 4 armed soldiers plus Marcus. No weapons. No escape route. The tower was designed to be impregnable from outside, which meant it was equally effective as prison. Whose orders, Marcus? The captain finally met her gaze. His eyes held genuine regret beneath professional necessity. Duke Montvale sends his regards. He's been paying me for 3 years. Information, access. Today he called in the debt. You're the price. The betrayal landed like blade between ribs. Marcus, Lucien trusts you, has trusted you for 8 years. I know. Marcus's expression hardened. and I've served him loyally for most of that time. But loyalty doesn't feed families or secure futures. Montvale offered my children titles, land, security that serving Blackthorn never provided. Sometimes survival requires choosing the winning side. You're destroying him. I'm making a practical decision. Same as he would. Marcus moved closer. Come peacefully, Lady Vale. You won't be harmed. Montvale wants you alive and compliant, not dead. That's more mercy than most get. Serafina looked at the guards surrounding her. Saw no hesitation, no doubt. These men followed orders without question or conscience. She had two choices: fight and die immediately, or comply and hope opportunity emerged later. Survival required adaptability. She walked toward Marcus with controlled dignity. Lead the way, Captain. Let's see what Duke Montvale considers valuable enough to buy 8 years of trust. They descended through corridors emptied by Lucien's deployment. The remaining guards had been positioned at external defense points, leaving internal spaces vulnerable. Marcus had planned this perfectly. Waited until Lucian committed forces elsewhere, positioned his own people at critical locations, transformed fortress into trap. They emerged into the courtyard where horses waited. 5 men, 6 horses, 1 for her. No one stopped them, no alarm sounded. Marcus controlled security completely. As they rode through the main gates, Serafina looked back at Blackthorn Keep one final time. The fortress stood dark against darker sky, empty, abandoned, waiting for a master who would return to find his greatest fear realized. His trust, the one thing he'd finally given after years of isolation, had been weaponized against him. They rode south through mountain passes Serafina recognized from her father's maps, toward Montvale territory, toward whatever fate awaited. Marcus remained silent the entire journey, his guilt obvious but insufficient to change course. Dawn broke as they crossed into Montvale lands. The estate that greeted them was smaller than Blackthorn Keep, but more ornate, designed to impress rather than defend. All the difference between men who earned power and men who inherited it. Duke Cedric Montvale waited in the main hall, dressed in expensive silks that screamed wealth without substance. He was older than Lucian by a decade. Softer, features that suggested he'd never gone hungry or fought for anything meaningful. He smiled when Serafina entered, Lady Vale. Finally. I've heard so much about you. He gestured to servants. See her to the guest quarters. Comfortable ones. We're not barbarians. Serafina stood her ground. What do you want? Montvale's smile widened. Such directness. I see why Blackthorn finds you fascinating. He circled her slowly, examining. I want several things, actually. Your cooperation in legitimizing my claim to Vale lands. Your signature on documents transferring Mountain Pass authority. And most importantly, I want to watch Lucien Blackthorn's face when he realizes his trust was misplaced and his protection was illusion. He leaned closer. You see, Lady Vale, the Iron Duke built his power on fear and control, made himself invulnerable through absolute isolation. Then you arrived and made him human again. Made him vulnerable. That vulnerability is his destruction. You underestimate him. Do I? Montvale's expression turned cold. Right now, Blackthorn is marching toward a pass where 3 battalions wait. My 3 battalions, yes, but also a trap. Narrow terrain becomes killing ground when enemies attack from multiple directions. By tonight, the Iron Duke will be dead or captured. Either way, his power ends. Serafina kept her expression neutral despite horror flooding through her. And if he survives? Then I still have you. Montvale gestured to guards. You're the one piece that makes him reckless, the one thing he'll sacrifice everything to protect. Which means you're the perfect leverage to force surrender without further bloodshed. He moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Lady Vale? Don't bother hoping for rescue. The 20 guards Blackthorn left at his keep, half were mine. The fortress is already secured. When he returns, if he returns, he'll find his home occupied and his leverage gone. Checkmate. Montvale left her standing in the hall, surrounded by guards, understanding the full scope of the trap. Lucien had been outmaneuvered completely, tactically, personally. Every strength turned into liability, every choice used against him. The man who controlled everything through fear and absolute calculation had finally encountered someone who played the game better. And he'd done it by exploiting the one weakness Lucien couldn't eliminate, his capacity to care about one person more than absolute power. Serafina was escorted to comfortable quarters that might as well have been dungeon, locked in, guarded constantly, treated with courtesy that barely masked captivity. She sat at the window, watching the sun climb higher, and understood with terrible clarity. She'd destroyed him, not intentionally, not maliciously, but effectively, by existing, by challenging him, by making him feel something beyond cold calculation. The Iron Duke, who survived through absolute control, had finally found something he couldn't control and couldn't sacrifice. And that vulnerability had been weaponized into total destruction. Somewhere north, Lucien was marching toward ambush. His fortress was compromised. His trust had been purchased and betrayed. His greatest fear was manifesting exactly as he'd always known it would. Trust was fatal. Weakness invited destruction. Vulnerability meant death. He'd been right all along, and Serafina had been the proof. She pressed her hand against the window glass, staring at northern mountains where a man who'd finally allowed himself to care was walking into trap designed specifically around that care. This was the moment, the pivot point, where every choice had led and every future branched. Either Lucien died, proving his philosophy correct, that attachment was suicide and isolation was survival, or he survived by becoming something else entirely, something that accepted vulnerability as strength rather than weakness. Something that understood power without connection was just elaborate dying. The question burning through Serafina's mind was simple and impossible. Could the Iron Duke transform into something human enough to survive what humanity cost? Or would Montvale's trap succeed precisely because Lucien could never change the foundation he'd built his entire identity upon? Evening approached with terrible certainty, and in mountain passes north of Montvale territory, Duke Lucien Blackthorn led his forces toward destiny that would either prove 8 years of philosophy correct or shatter everything he'd become in the fires of total warfare. The endgame had begun, and nobody, not Lucien, not Serafina, not even Montvale in his moment of calculated triumph, truly understood how it would end. Only that blood was coming, and transformation was inevitable. And the man who'd spent 8 years proving that power without weakness was the only path to survival, was about to discover if that truth could withstand the one test it was never designed for: loving someone more than survival itself. The mountain pass stretched before Lucien like nature's killing ground. Narrow walls of stone rose on both sides, creating a corridor barely wide enough for 3 horses abreast. Perfect defensive terrain if you controlled the high ground, perfect death trap if you didn't. Lucien raised his fist, halting the column behind him. Something felt wrong. The kind of wrong that lived in your spine before your mind processed why. Marcus would have sensed it too. Would have been riding beside him right now, scanning terrain with the same instinct that kept them both alive through 8 years of consolidating power through calculated violence. But Marcus wasn't here, had stayed behind to coordinate, keep defenses. Lucien pushed the thought aside. Focus on immediate threat. Trust could be examined later, after survival was secured. He turned to his second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Dmitri, who'd served since the early days when bodies still piled in castle courtyards. Send scouts ahead. Full reconnaissance. I want eyes on every ridge, every outcropping, every position where ambush could manifest. Dmitri saluted and dispatched riders immediately. The main force waited in tense silence. 200 men, the core of Blackthorn military power, elite soldiers who'd fought through the worst consolidation battles and emerged as something harder than normal warriors. They trusted Lucien because he'd never led them into slaughter, never spent lives carelessly, every engagement calculated, every risk measured. That reputation was about to be tested. The scouts returned 15 minutes later. One was bleeding from a crossbow bolt through his shoulder. The other looked shaken in ways combat veterans rarely showed. "Your Grace," the wounded scout spoke through gritted teeth. 3 battalions, positioned on the ridges. Crossbows. Archers. They're waiting for us to enter the kill zone. How many total? At least 600. Maybe more in reserve positions we couldn't see. Lucien absorbed this without visible reaction. 600 against 200 in terrain they controlled. The mathematics were brutal. Dmitri moved closer, speaking quietly. "Your Grace, this is suicide. We need to withdraw, regroup, find alternate routes." Lucien studied the pass with absolute focus. His mind calculated angles, assessed options, measured costs against necessity. Every military instinct screamed retreat. Live to fight when odds were better. Preserve forces for battles you could win. But military instinct didn't account for what waited behind him. Serafina. Alone in his keep with guards whose loyalty suddenly felt uncertain. If he retreated now, delayed confrontation, Montvale had time to move, to seize Vale lands. To eliminate the one person who'd made Lucian remember that power without purpose was just elaborate survival. His father had believed in honor, in noble sacrifice, in fighting for things beyond mere victory. His father died screaming, but his father had also lived, really lived, felt things, connected to things, died protecting something he considered worth the cost. Lucian had spent 8 years proving that philosophy was fatal weakness, that isolation was survival, that caring about anything except absolute control invited destruction. Now he stood at the edge of a kill zone, facing odds that made survival unlikely, and understood with terrible clarity that his father's supposed weakness might have been the only thing worth calling strength. He turned to face his army. 200 men, hardened killers who'd followed him through hell because he never asked them to die pointlessly. He was about to break that pattern. Listen carefully, his voice carried across the assembled force. Montvale has 600 soldiers waiting in ambush. They control the high ground. They have superior numbers and positioning. Every tactical advantage belongs to them. Silence greeted this assessment. Retreating means abandoning our objective, means giving Montvale time to consolidate, means everyone I promised to protect dies while we regroup and plan. Lucian met eyes across the formation. I won't order you into this. Any man who wants to withdraw has my permission. No shame, no consequences. This is suicide by every reasonable measure. Nobody moved. Lucian felt something crack in his chest. Pride. Respect. The kind of loyalty that couldn't be purchased with fear alone. But I'm going forward. Because sometimes survival isn't the goal. Sometimes you fight because losing everything is still better than living with what you'd become by walking away. He drew his sword. Today, we prove that 200 warriors who refuse to yield are worth more than 600 who think numbers guarantee victory. He turned his horse toward the pass. Anyone still with me? Stay close. We're about to make those odds regret themselves. The roar that erupted from his soldiers carried something beyond mere battle readiness. It carried understanding, recognition, the acknowledgement that they were following a man who'd finally found something worth dying for beyond calculated power. Lucian led them into the pass at full gallop. The ambush triggered immediately. Crossbow bolts rained from the ridges like steel rainfall. Men screamed, horses shrieked. The narrow corridor became chaos within seconds. Lucian felt a bolt glance off his armor, felt his horse stumble. He kicked free before the animal went down, rolling to his feet with sword already moving. A Montvale soldier rushed from hidden position. Lucian's blade took him through the throat before the man finished his attack swing. Blood sprayed hot across Lucian's face. More soldiers poured from concealed positions along the pass walls. Not just archers. Infantry. Montvale had packed the ambush with overwhelming force. Dmitri fought beside Lucian, bellowing commands. Shield wall! Defensive formation! But shields meant nothing against arrows from above and soldiers from all sides. This wasn't battle. This was execution dressed as combat. Lucian's mind calculated with cold clarity even as his body moved through violence. They couldn't win. Not here. Not like this. Every second cost lives. Every moment they stayed meant fewer men survived. But retreat meant death just as surely. The pass offered no escape route, no alternate path. They'd committed fully the moment they entered, which meant the only option was forward, through the killing ground, through whatever waited beyond. Accept the cost. Pay the price. Survive or don't, but never stop moving. Lucian roared above the chaos. Forward! We break through or we die here. No middle ground. His soldiers responded like men possessed. They stopped trying to defend, started attacking with suicidal aggression, turned ambush into close-quarters slaughter where superior numbers became liability in confined space. The Montvale forces hadn't expected that. Expected terror. Expected retreat. Expected rational opponents who recognized losing odds. They got warriors who'd decided death was acceptable outcome as long as it came while advancing. The psychology shift changed everything. Suddenly, Montvale soldiers were backing up. Suddenly, the tight pass worked against defenders trying to maintain distance. Suddenly, 600 became irrelevant when only 20 could fight at once in narrow corridor. Lucian carved through bodies like violence made manifest. His sword never stopped moving. Block, strike, kill, move. Again, again, again. His breathing came ragged. His muscles screamed. Blood covered him, impossible to tell whose anymore. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Behind him, his soldiers matched his intensity. Dying, yes. Falling, absolutely. But taking enemies with them, making every inch of ground cost blood and terror. This was what happened when men fought without fear of death, when survival became secondary to objective, when nothing remained to lose except the battle itself. The Montvale commander, watching from ridge position, made his critical mistake. He committed reserve forces, sent them pouring into the pass to overwhelm through sheer numbers, which packed the corridor so tight that combat became pressing crowd rather than tactical engagement. Bodies crushed against bodies. Space disappeared. Order collapsed into mob physics. And in mob physics, armor mattered less than weight and momentum. Lucien saw the opportunity instantly. He roared the command, "Push, drive forward, make them crush themselves." His surviving soldiers became battering ram. They stopped trying to kill, started trying to advance, used shields as bulldozers, used bodies as weapons, turned packed corridor into compression chamber. The Montvale forces trapped in center had nowhere to go. Couldn't retreat because reserves blocked rear positions. Couldn't advance because Blackthorn soldiers refused to yield ground. Couldn't fight effectively because space prevented weapon use. They started breaking. First one, then 10. Then entire sections collapsing into panicked retreat that cascaded backward through packed formations. Lucien pressed advantage ruthlessly. His forces surged forward into suddenly crumbling defense. The pass that had been killing ground became breakthrough corridor. They emerged from the far end, drenched in blood and gasping for air. Lucien counted survivors rapidly. 68 out of 200, the mathematics of hell. But they'd done the impossible. Broken through superior force in defensive position. Survived what should have killed them all. Dmitri staggered to his side, bleeding from a dozen wounds. "Your Grace, we did it. We actually did it." Lucien looked back at the pass, at the bodies piled so thick you couldn't see stone beneath them, at the cost of refusing to accept defeat, at the price of caring about something more than survival. No. His voice came hollow. "We survived. That's not the same as winning, because Montvale's ambush wasn't the real objective. It was delay, distraction, time purchased to secure what actually mattered. And Lucien had just spent hours and most of his army fighting through it, which meant Serafina had been alone in compromised fortress for far too long. "Mount up, every man who can still ride." His voice carried absolute command despite exhaustion. "We ride for Blackthorn Keep, now." The remaining soldiers, broken and bleeding and pushed beyond human endurance, climbed onto horses without hesitation. They rode north like death-given direction. Past exhaustion, past pain, past reason. Because that's what happened when leaders finally showed soldiers they'd found something worth the cost. The men followed into hell itself because the alternative was living with shame. Night fell before they reached Blackthorn territory. The horses were dying beneath them. The soldiers were more corpse than warrior. But they didn't stop, couldn't stop. Lucien drove them harder than he'd ever driven anyone, harder than tactical necessity demanded. Desperation powered him now. The growing certainty that while he'd been proving his soldiers' loyalty in mountain passes, he'd lost what actually mattered. Marcus, his captain, his trusted advisor, 8 years of partnership. The mathematics kept screaming wrongness, the ambush, the timing, the precision of Montvale's intelligence. Someone inside Blackthorn forces had fed information, had positioned pieces perfectly, had known exactly how Lucien would respond to rebellion and threat. Marcus knew everything, had access to everything, could compromise everything. But that meant 8 years of trust was purchased betrayal. That loyalty Lucien had believed absolute was just longer deception. That he'd been right all along. Trust was fatal. Attachments were weapons. The iron philosophy that built his power was being proven correct through agony of its violation. Dawn broke as Blackthorn Keep came into view. Something was wrong immediately. The banners. Wrong colors on the battlements. Montvale colors. His fortress had fallen. Lucien pulled his exhausted horse to stop, staring at his home occupied by enemy forces. Dmitri rode up beside him. Your Grace, we're outnumbered, exhausted. We can't take the keep with 60 wounded men against a garrisoned force. Lucian's hand tightened on his sword until knuckles went white. Serafina was in there, behind walls he'd built, protected by guards who'd betrayed him, held by enemies who understood exactly what leverage she represented. Every rational calculation said, wait. Regroup, gather forces, plan assault. Every rational calculation could burn. He'd spent 8 years being rational, being calculated, being the Iron Duke who never let emotion compromise tactical judgment. Look where that got him. Fortress compromised, army decimated, trust betrayed. And the one person who'd made him remember what being human felt like was captive inside walls he couldn't breach. This was the moment. The fulcrum. The point where philosophy either held or shattered completely. He could withdraw. Preserve remaining forces. Plan methodical response. Prove that isolation and calculation were still correct even when they cost everything. Or he could charge those gates with 60 broken warriors and embrace the chaos of caring more about one person than perfect tactics. His father's way. The way that got his father killed, but also the way his father had actually lived before dying. Lucien turned to face his exhausted soldiers, men who'd followed him through hell, men who'd lost brothers in mountain passes, men who should rightfully demand retreat. He spoke quietly, every word chosen. I'm going in there. I'm getting her back. I'm killing everyone who helped take her. His voice carried absolute certainty. I don't expect you to follow. You've given everything already. More than any leader has right to demand. If you ride away now, you'll have my gratitude and my respect. Silence answered him. Then Dmitri urged his dying horse forward. Your Grace, I've followed you for 7 years. Watched you build power through fear and control. Watched you survive by eliminating weakness. His scarred face showed something like understanding. Today, I watched you find something worth fighting for beyond survival. That's worth following into death. The other soldiers moved forward, all 60, wounded, exhausted, facing impossible odds, but following anyway. Because leadership wasn't about fear anymore. It was about showing people something worth dying for and going first. Lucian felt the weight of command settle differently now. Not burden, purpose. He drew his sword. Dmitri, take 30 men, find the western entrance, the old siege tunnels. They'll be guarded, but not as heavily as main gates. And you, Your Grace, I'm taking 30 men through the front gate. His smile carried no humor. Montvale wants to make my fortress into trap. Let's show him what traps look like when the prey becomes predator. They split into 2 groups. 30 soldiers following Dmitri toward concealed entrance, 30 remaining with Lucian staring at main gates flying Montvale colors. This was insanity, suicide, everything tactical doctrine warned against. But tactical doctrine hadn't accounted for the kind of rage that came from watching 8 years of careful construction collapse because he'd finally let himself care. Lucien spurred his horse forward at full gallop. His 30 soldiers followed without hesitation. The charge toward his own gates felt like declaration. Like transformation, like final rejection of everything he'd built his identity upon. The guards on the walls saw them coming, started shouting warnings. Crossbows appeared on battlements. Too late. Lucien hit the gates at full speed. The impact should have killed his horse. Probably did. He rolled free as the animal collapsed, came up running, sword already swinging. The gates had been barred from inside. Smart. Standard siege procedure. Lucien didn't slow. He hit the wood with his shoulder, felt ancient oak groan but hold. His soldiers crashed into the gates beside him, 30 men using their bodies as battering ram against entrance designed to withstand armies. The wood splintered, cracked, gave. They poured through into the courtyard. Montvale soldiers waited in formation, organized, prepared, disciplined. They died anyway. Because Lucian's 30 warriors weren't fighting as military unit anymore. They were fighting as men who'd transcended survival instinct, who'd moved past fear into something purer and more terrible. Lucien carved through defenders like he was reclaiming sacred ground. Every swing was statement. Every kill was declaration. This was his fortress, his home, his territory. And he would paint it red before surrendering one stone. The Montvale commander tried to organize defensive positions, tried to use superior numbers to contain the breach. But you couldn't contain men who'd stopped caring if they survived. From the western section, sounds of secondary breach. Dimitri's group hitting through siege tunnels. Now Montvale forces face threats from two directions in courtyard, not designed for internal combat. Chaos spread like wildfire. Lucian fought toward the keep's main entrance, toward the tower where he'd left Serafina, where she'd been taken, where she was being held as leverage against exactly this response. Bodies piled around him. His breath came in ragged gasps. Blood and sweat stung his eyes. His muscles screamed exhaustion. He didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not while she was in there. Not while Montvale thought winning was accomplished fact. He reached the tower entrance. The door was barred. Heavily. Lucian turned to find something to use as ram. Found instead his remaining soldiers had followed him. Fewer now. Maybe 20. Maybe less. Hard to count through blood and exhaustion. They understood without words. Formed line. Charged the door together. The wood exploded inward. Lucian climbed stairs 3 at a time. Each level a century. Each corridor an eternity. Finally he reached the top level. The door to his private quarters. It opened before he touched it. Captain Marcus stood in the doorway. Behind him, Duke Cedric Montvale. And behind them both, Serafina, bound to a chair but alive and unharmed. The tableau froze for one perfect moment. Then Lucien moved. Marcus was ready. Had always been ready. His sword came up to block Lucian's attack with practiced familiarity, born from years training together. They'd sparred 1,000 times, knew each other's patterns, each other's tells, each other's weaknesses. That knowledge cut both ways now. Lucian attacked with everything he had. Not technique, not training. Pure violence powered by betrayal and rage. Marcus defended with skill and guilt visible in his eyes, even as his blade moved to counter. You have to understand. Marcus spoke between strikes. I had no choice. Montvale had my family, had evidence that would destroy them. I couldn't save it. Lucien's blade crashed against Marcus's guard. You made your choice. Now live with consequences. Their swords rang through the chamber. Around them, the sounds of continued fighting echoed from below. Montvale watched with satisfied smile. Such loyalty, such devotion, and all of it so easily purchased. He gestured to Serafina. She's alive, Blackthorn. Unharmed, yield, and she stays that way. Lucian didn't take his eyes off Marcus, his former captain, his trusted advisor, the man who'd helped build everything and then sold it all. Never. Then she dies. Simple. Montvale drew a dagger, moved toward Serafina with theatrical slowness. That's when Marcus made his mistake. He glanced toward Serafina. Just for a second. Just enough to see if Lucien would yield. That second cost him everything. Lucian's blade swept past Marcus's guard and opened his throat in one precise movement. Blood sprayed. Marcus collapsed, choking, eyes wide with shock and something that might have been relief. Lucien stepped over the body without pause, without looking down, without acknowledgement beyond the kill itself. Montvale backed up, suddenly understanding that calculation and leverage meant nothing against someone who'd transcended rational behavior. Wait, we can negotiate. We can... Lucien was done negotiating. His sword took Montvale through the chest before the man finished his plea, pinned him to the wall like insect to board. Montvale stared down at the blade protruding from his body with incomprehension. You lose. Lucian's voice came flat and cold. Not because you miscalculated, because you thought fear and leverage were enough. You were wrong. He twisted the blade. Montvale screamed, then died. Silence crashed over the chamber. Lucien crossed to Serafina, cutting her bonds with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. She stood on unsteady legs, staring at him like seeing someone entirely new. You came. Her voice barely whispered. Through impossible odds, through ambush and siege, you came. Lucien caught her face between bloody hands, forcing her to look at him, at what he'd become, at the cost of caring. I burned everything to get here, destroyed tactical advantage, spent my army, killed 8 years of careful construction. His voice cracked slightly. Because losing you was the only outcome I couldn't accept. That's not strategy. That's not power. That's just truth. Serafina kissed him despite the blood, despite the violence, despite everything. When they separated, she spoke quietly. You're not the Iron Duke anymore. No. Lucien agreed. That man died in a mountain pass when he decided someone else mattered more than absolute control. Then what are you now? He looked at the bodies, at the ruined chamber, at his fortress retaken through sacrifice and suicidal loyalty. Something worse, something better. I don't know yet. From below, the sounds of fighting faded. Either his soldiers had won or been overwhelmed. Either way, the battle approached conclusion. Lucien and Serafina descended together. They emerged into courtyard painted red. Bodies everywhere, his soldiers, Montvale's. Impossible to tell which side had more corpses. But blackthorn banners flew again on the battlements. Dmitri staggered forward, bleeding from wounds that should have killed him. Your Grace, the keep is secure. Montvale forces surrendered or died. His voice carried exhaustion beyond measure. We did it. Lucien looked at the devastation, the cost, the price of refusing to yield. How many? Dmitri's silence answered before words could. 17 survived, Your Grace. Out of 200 who marched with you, the mathematics landed like physical blow. 183 dead. For one woman and one fortress, and one refusal to accept that isolation was the only path to survival. His father would have called it heroic sacrifice. His younger self would have called it catastrophic failure. Now Lucien understood it was just truth. The real price of being human in a world designed to punish humanity. He turned to address the 17 survivors, men who'd followed him through hell and emerged as something beyond simple soldiers. You gave everything. Lost brothers. Lost certainty. Lost the leader you thought you followed. His voice carried across the quiet courtyard. I can't give back what was lost. Can't undo the cost. Can only promise that what you bought with blood matters, means something, made this territory worth defending. The survivors stood straighter despite exhaustion, despite wounds, despite grief, because that's what happened when sacrifice was acknowledged rather than exploited. Serafina moved beside Lucien, surveying the destruction. What happens now? Now? Lucien stared at his reclaimed fortress, at the bodies of enemies and allies both, at the wreckage of 8 years of carefully constructed power. Now we rebuild. Differently. Not through fear alone, not through isolation, through something messier and more dangerous and more human. The king will demand answers. Let him demand. Lucien's smile carried no warmth. I have Vale lands. I have evidence of Montvale's treason. I have testimony from survivors about rebellion funded by a duke the king failed to police. His Majesty can negotiate from weakness, or we can discuss how I now control military routes he desperately needs. That's dangerous politics. All politics are dangerous. At least now I'm fighting for something beyond mere survival. The sun climbed higher over Blackthorn Keep, over fortress retaken through sacrifice, over territory held by men who'd discovered that sometimes the only thing worth having was worth dying for. Lucien stood with Serafina beside him and 17 exhausted warriors at his back and understood with perfect clarity he'd destroyed everything the Iron Duke represented and built something else in the ruins. Something vulnerable and messy and utterly human. Something his father might have recognized. Something that might actually be worth calling power. But that understanding would be tested immediately. Because in the distance, dust rose from approaching cavalry. Large formation, military discipline, moving with purpose toward Blackthorn Keep, royal banners flying above them. The king had arrived to demand answers about rebellion, treason, and a duke who defied direct orders during national crisis. Lucien was exhausted. His army was decimated. His political position was catastrophically vulnerable. And the man riding to confront him controlled legitimacy, legal authority, and military resources that could crush what remained of Blackthorn power. Serafina saw the approaching force and tensed. Lucien, we're not ready for this. No, he agreed. We're not. Then what do we do? Lucien watched the royal cavalry approach, watched his world narrow to single choice. Submit to authority and accept judgment from power structure that enabled Montvale's treason, or stand ground and risk everything on principle that some things mattered more than survival. 8 years ago, he would have calculated angles, would have found political maneuvering that preserved power while appearing to yield. 8 hours ago, he would have done the same. Now he'd just spent everything proving that calculation wasn't enough, that surviving without purpose was just slower dying, that the only thing separating human from animal was willingness to risk everything for something beyond mere existence. He turned to Serafina, kissed her once. Brief and claiming and possibly final. Stay behind me. Whatever happens next, stay behind me. Lucien, what are you going to do? His smile carried something wild and dangerous and utterly committed. I'm going to tell the king the truth. That his kingdom failed. That his authority enabled treason. That his orders would have cost everything worth protecting. And that if he wants my territory, my routes, my military infrastructure, he can acknowledge what I've built. Or he can try to take it by force and see how that works out. That's treason. Maybe. Lucien drew his sword one more time despite exhaustion screaming through his body. Or maybe it's the only honest conversation this kingdom has had in decades. Either way, we're about to find out if power built on fear and control is stronger than power built on purpose. The royal cavalry reached the gates. The king's herald called out demands in voice designed to carry authority. Duke Lucien Blackthorn, by order of His Majesty, you are commanded to open these gates and submit to royal judgment for defying direct military orders during national crisis. Lucien stood atop the walls, blood-stained, exhausted, flanked by 17 warriors who looked like death. He called back with voice that carried absolute certainty. His Majesty is welcome to enter my fortress, to inspect how rebellion was stopped while his other dukes enabled it, to see evidence of treason his court failed to prevent, to negotiate terms for continued cooperation between Crown and the territory that actually maintains order in the north. The herald looked shocked. Those are not terms you offer your king. Lucien's eyes went flat and cold. They are when the king's incompetence nearly destroyed everything his northern duchy protects. Either His Majesty acknowledges reality and we discuss partnership between equals, or he can attempt to seize my territory by force, and we'll see which authority actually matters when philosophy meets steel. The words hung in morning air like declaration of war. Below, the king's guard shifted nervously. This was unprecedented. Dukes didn't speak to kings this way, didn't demand negotiation as equals, didn't threaten royal authority with consequence. The gates opened slowly. A single rider emerged from royal formation, crown visible even at distance. The king himself, coming to confront the duke who just challenged everything monarchy represented. Lucien descended to meet him. Serafina insisted on following. The 17 survivors formed honor guard that looked more like threat than ceremony. They met in the blood-stained courtyard, surrounded by evidence of battles fought and won through sacrifice rather than strategy. King Harrison was older than Lucien by 2 decades, soft from court life, features that suggested he'd never personally fought for anything. But his eyes held intelligence, calculation, the kind of mind that survived political warfare even while physical warfare was delegated to others. He examined the carnage, the bodies, the exhausted survivors, the reclaimed fortress. When he spoke, his voice carried weariness rather than anger. You defied direct orders, Blackthorn, refused deployment during rebellion, compromised military response, acted in direct contradiction to royal authority. Lucien met his gaze without flinching. I stopped a treason conspiracy your court failed to detect. I preserved territory your other dukes were selling to rebels. I paid in blood to protect infrastructure your kingdom depends upon. His voice remained level. Your Majesty can punish me for insubordination or acknowledge that sometimes the men fighting battles understand them better than the men giving orders. The king's expression remained unreadable. You're asking me to validate disobedience. I'm asking you to recognize reality. Lucien gestured to the evidence around them. Montvale armed rebels, used his position to destabilize your kingdom. Would have succeeded if I'd followed protocol and deployed west like ordered. Sometimes, survival requires defying authority that's wrong. And you decide when authority is wrong? Someone has to. When authority becomes complicit through incompetence, subordinates must choose between obedience and effectiveness. I chose effectiveness. The silence stretched. King Harrison studied Lucien with visible assessment, weighing risks, calculating angles, deciding if maintaining royal dignity mattered more than maintaining northern stability. Finally, he spoke. You're either the most dangerous threat to monarchy or the only duke honest enough to say what others think. I haven't decided which. Perhaps I'm both, Your Majesty. The king almost smiled. You've created an impossible situation, Blackthorn. I can't publicly reward disobedience, but I also can't afford to lose the only territory that actually maintains order. So we find middle ground that preserves both our positions. What middle ground? You accept censure for insubordination. Formal reprimand. Public acknowledgement of overstepping authority. In exchange, I grant you expanded territorial control and acknowledge your effectiveness in stopping Montvale's conspiracy. Lucian considered this. Political theater that preserved royal dignity while rewarding the very behavior it claimed to punish. His younger self would have accepted immediately, would have seen it as victory. Now he understood it as compromise, the kind that let everyone save face while nothing fundamentally changed. No. The king's eyebrows rose. No? Lucian shook his head. You're offering me slightly larger cage and calling it freedom. I don't want expanded control under your authority. I want acknowledgement that the North governs itself, reports to Crown, but makes decisions based on reality rather than waiting for orders that arrive too late to matter. You're demanding autonomy. I'm demanding functionality. Your authority matters for trade agreements and international relations, but military decisions, territorial security, immediate crisis response, those need to happen at speed only local leadership can provide. King Harrison's expression hardened. That's functionally independence. No, it's a distributed authority. You remain king, I remain duke. But the relationship acknowledges that governance works better when those closest to problems solve them without waiting for permission from capital cities that don't understand local reality. And if I refuse, then we discover if monarchy built on tradition is stronger than duchy built on results. Lucian's voice carried absolute certainty. I'd prefer partnership, Your Majesty. But I won't accept subordination that costs lives and enables incompetence. The standoff crystallized into moment of decision. King Harrison could assert authority, could demand submission, could push confrontation to breaking point, or he could acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that Lucian had just proven. Sometimes effective leadership required defying ineffective authority. The king studied Lucian for a long moment. Then he laughed. Short, sharp, genuine. You're going to be a spectacular problem for my successor. But fine. Autonomy for Northern Territory with reporting requirements to Crown. You govern. I receive intelligence. We cooperate where interests align and stay out of each other's way otherwise. He extended his hand. Partnership between equals. God help us both. Lucian shook it, feeling weight of decision, of transformation, of world-changing shape around choices made under pressure. Thank you, Your Majesty. Don't thank me yet, Blackthorn. The king's expression turned serious. You just set precedent. Other territories will demand similar arrangements. You may have accidentally started evolution toward distributed governance that undermined centralized monarchy. Perhaps centralized monarchy undermined itself by failing to adapt. Fair point. The king turned toward his cavalry. His voice carried. The Duke has explained circumstances. Montvale's treason has been stopped. Northern Territory remains loyal and effective. We return to capital with new understanding of how governance must evolve. He mounted his horse, pausing to look back at Lucian one final time. You're the most dangerous kind of leader, Blackthorn, the kind who makes people question whether the old ways still work. That's either revolution or evolution. Time will tell which. Then the royal cavalry departed, leaving Lucian standing in his blood-soaked courtyard with Serafina beside him and 17 survivors watching and the future suddenly wide open in terrifying ways. He'd defied king and survived, had demanded change and received acknowledgement, had proven that sometimes transformation required burning everything down and rebuilding from ashes. But that transformation came with costs still being calculated. 183 dead. 8 years of careful construction shattered. Reputation as Iron Duke destroyed and replaced with something undefined. And the certainty, cold and absolute, that he'd just set forces in motion that would reshape not just his territory, but the entire kingdom's understanding of authority and governance. Serafina took his hand. You did it. Changed everything. Lucian stared at horizon where royal cavalry disappeared. No, we did it. And I have no idea if what comes next is better or just different kind of disaster. Does it matter? He turned to face her, to face the choice he'd made, to face the man he'd become through fire and sacrifice, and refusing to accept that survival without purpose was enough. No, it doesn't. Because at least now I'm fighting for something worth the cost instead of just fighting to survive another day. They stood together as sun climbed higher. As survivors began clearing bodies and tending wounds and processing trauma of battle survived, the Iron Duke was dead, destroyed in mountain passes and siege warfare and confrontation with monarchy itself. What remained was something messier, more human, more vulnerable, more real. Lucian Blackthorn had spent 8 years proving that power without weakness was the only path to survival. Then he'd spent one day discovering that sometimes the only thing worth surviving for required embracing exactly the weakness he'd spent years eliminating. Whether that made him stronger or just differently broken remained to be seen. But he stood on his battlements with Serafina beside him and 17 survivors below, and the future wide open before them all. And for the first time in 8 years, he felt something other than calculated control. He felt alive. The days following the king's departure moved with the strange slowness of aftermath. Battle ended in hours. Healing took months, sometimes years, sometimes never finished at all. Lucien stood in the war room alone, staring at maps that suddenly felt like relics from another life. Territory markers, supply routes, strategic positions, all the careful planning that had consumed 8 years of calculated existence. None of it had mattered when the real test arrived. None of the fear-based control, none of the isolation designed to prevent vulnerability, none of the philosophy that promised survival through emotional amputation. He'd survived anyway, but not through the methods he'd spent years perfecting, through their exact opposite, through caring so completely about one person that tactical advantage became secondary to keeping her alive, through trusting soldiers enough that they followed him into suicide charges, through confronting a king and demanding partnership instead of accepting subordination. The Iron Duke would have called that weakness, would have seen each choice as catastrophic failure of discipline. The man Lucian was becoming understood it differently. Understood that maybe his father's supposed weakness had been the only real strength available to humans navigating impossible situations. That connection, vulnerability, trust, all the things he'd eliminated as tactical liabilities were actually the only things separating survival from merely existing. But understanding came with cost. Always cost. The door opened behind him. He didn't turn, knew by the footsteps who approached. Serafina moved beside him, studying the same maps. She'd been quieter since the siege, not withdrawn, just processing what they'd both witnessed, what they'd both become through fire and violence. You haven't slept. Her voice carried observation without judgment. Sleep feels like luxury I haven't earned yet. Lucian gestured to the maps. 183 men died following me. That's not tactical calculation. That's mass sacrifice. I'm trying to understand if what we bought with their blood justifies the price. Serafina was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her words carried weight earned through her own trauma. My father used to say that leaders who don't question the cost of their decisions are the most dangerous kind, because they've stopped seeing people as people, started seeing them as resources to be spent. She traced one of the routes on the map. You're questioning. That matters. Does it? Lucian finally turned to face her. Does questioning change that 183 families just lost fathers, brothers, sons? Does my philosophical crisis make their deaths meaningful instead of wasteful? Nothing makes death meaningful except what comes after, what you build with the time they bought you. Serafina held his gaze. You can honor them by creating something worth their sacrifice, or dishonor them by treating their deaths as tragedy that paralyzes you. Your choice. The words settled like verdict, like challenge, like truth. Lucian moved to the window overlooking the courtyard. Below, the surviving 17 worked alongside new recruits who'd arrived in the aftermath, clearing debris, repairing damage, building something from ruins. Dmitri led them despite wounds that should have kept him bedridden. The scarred veteran moved with purpose that suggested he'd found meaning in survival, found brotherhood in shared trauma, found something worth continuing for. That's what soldiers did, carried impossible weight and kept moving because the alternative was dishonoring those who fell beside them. Leaders owed them the same dedication. Lucian spoke without looking away from the window. I spent 8 years building power through fear, through making everyone too afraid to betray me, through eliminating every connection that could become liability. His voice carried something raw, philosophical framework. It worked, after a fashion. Kept me alive, kept territory stable. But it also meant that when real crisis arrived, the only thing holding my world together was more fear. And fear breaks, eventually. Always breaks. So what holds things together now? Serafina moved beside him at the window. I don't know yet, Lucian admitted. Something messier, more fragile, more human. Purpose, maybe. Shared investment in outcomes. Trust earned through action rather than fear enforced through violence. He glanced at her. You tell me. You're the one who challenged everything I'd built. What comes after the Iron Duke? Serafina considered carefully before answering. After the Iron Duke comes, the man who learned that power without purpose is just elaborate survival. That control without connection is loneliness wearing armor. That the only thing separating tyrants from leaders is whether people follow from fear or because the destination matters. Her hand found his. You're building something different now. It'll be harder, more vulnerable, more likely to fail. But at least it'll be real. Real! Lucian tested the word like unfamiliar concept. I'm not sure I know how to do real. 8 years of performance and calculation. 8 years of treating every interaction as potential threat. That doesn't just disappear because I decided vulnerability might be acceptable risk. Then you learn. Same as everyone else stumbling through existence, trying to figure out if connection is worth the pain it inevitably causes. Serafina's smile carried understanding. You're not special in that struggle. You're just human. Finally. The assessment should have felt like insult. Instead, it landed like relief. Being human, being fallible, being uncertain, all the things he'd spent years trying to eliminate, all the things his father's death taught him were fatal weaknesses. Maybe they were. Maybe embracing humanity was just slower suicide in a world designed to punish softness. But at least it was living before dying. At least it was feeling something beyond constant calculation. At least it was mattering to someone in a way that transcended pure utility. His father had lived that way, had died screaming, but had also known love and connection and purpose beyond mere survival. Maybe that trade was acceptable. Maybe dying while fully alive beat surviving while essentially dead. Lucien was still processing that radical possibility when commotion erupted in the courtyard below. New arrivals, multiple carriages, moving with formal precision that suggested official business rather than personal visit. Dmitri appeared at the war room door minutes later. Your Grace. Representatives from the northern noble houses. They request audience. All of them. All of them? Lucian's eyes narrowed. That's coordinated. That's threat or opportunity disguised as diplomacy. Shall I send them away? No. Lucien straightened, commander returning even as exhaustion pulled at him. We received them. Main hall. Full formal protocol. If they're here to challenge, we meet that standing. Understood. Dmitri hesitated. Your Grace, you should know. They're bringing their heirs, their eldest children. That's not typical for hostile negotiation. No, it's not. Lucien absorbed this detail. Its statement. Its demonstration of commitment or vulnerability. Either way, it's significant. Alert the household. Full reception. An hour later, Lucien stood in the great hall where Serafina had first challenged him weeks ago. Felt like lifetime. Felt like yesterday. Time moved strangely in wake of transformation. Serafina stood beside him. Not behind. Beside. Equal positioning. That alone was statement to nobles accustomed to wives and daughters relegated to secondary status. The northern houses entered in order of seniority. Lord Ashford, Lady Merrick, Duke Rothwell, Count Vasily. 8 major families in total, each accompanied by their designated heir. They arranged themselves in formal semicircle facing Lucien and Serafina. Lord Ashford, eldest and most traditional, spoke first. Duke Blackthorn, we come seeking understanding. Your actions in recent weeks have been, to speak plainly, unprecedented. Defying royal deployment, challenging established authority, demanding autonomy rather than accepting traditional hierarchy. His voice carried no hostility, just assessment. The Northern Territories need to know what this means for our relationships, whether you seek cooperation or dominance, partnership or subjugation. Lucien let the question settle, recognized it for what it was, not challenge, uncertainty. These nobles had spent years navigating his fear-based governance. Now he'd changed fundamental approach, and they didn't know how to calibrate. Fair question. Lucian's voice carried across the stone hall. I'll answer directly. The Iron Duke who ruled through fear and elimination of threats, no longer exists. That man died in Mountain Pass when he discovered that surviving without purpose was just slower dying. He moved forward slightly. What replaces him is less certain, less controlled, more human, and therefore more fallible. I'm building governance based on shared investment in outcomes rather than enforced submission to authority, which means this territory succeeds or fails based on whether we cooperate toward mutual benefit or compete for relative advantage. And if we choose competition, Duke Rothwell asked, blunt, direct, testing boundaries. Then you discover that while I've changed philosophy, I haven't lost capacity for violence. Lucian's expression went cold enough that several nobles shifted uncomfortably. I prefer partnership, but I'm still capable of removing threats that endanger what I'm trying to build. That capacity hasn't diminished, just the eagerness to deploy it. The nobles absorbed this carefully. Leadership offering choice while making consequences clear. Different tone than pure intimidation, but still carrying weight. Lady Merrick spoke next, intelligent eyes assessing. And Lady Serafina Vale, her position in your restructured governance? Equal partner. Lucian glanced at Serafina. She challenged me when no one else dared, spoke truth when everyone else performed theater, survived assassination attempts while helping expose treason. She's earned authority through competence, not granted it through courtesy. Several nobles looked scandalized. Women didn't hold equal authority in northern territories. Tradition forbade it. Custom prevented it. Lucian didn't care. Tradition that prohibits competent leadership based on gender is tradition that deserves elimination. If that offends traditional sensibilities, there's the door. My territory, my rules. His voice carried finality. Partner with effectiveness or cling to customs that limit potential. Your choice. The nobles exchanged glances, calculations visible behind formal expressions. Finally, Count Vasily, youngest of the major lords, spoke. Duke Blackthorn. We didn't come to challenge. We came seeking alliance. His voice carried conviction. You've proven something we've all suspected, but none dared voice. That the old systems are failing. That governance through fear and rigid hierarchy creates brittleness rather than strength. That adaptation matters more than tradition. He gestured to the heirs accompanying each noble. We brought our children because we want them to learn from what you're building. Want them to see that leadership evolves. That power without purpose is insufficient. That the future belongs to those willing to question rather than those comfortable with inherited authority. The words landed like declaration, like transformation spreading beyond Blackthorn Keep. Lucian felt weight of it, responsibility. These nobles weren't just acknowledging his changes, they were investing in them, betting their children's futures on his uncertain experiment in governance that prioritized purpose over pure power. That was trust, real trust, the kind that couldn't be enforced through fear, the kind his father would have recognized, then partnership. Lucian addressed them all. We build this together, share information, coordinate resources, support each other through transition from old systems to whatever comes next. But understand clearly, I won't tolerate exploitation, won't accept nobles using new flexibility to oppress those beneath them differently. We're rebuilding towards something better, not just rearranging same cruelty with prettier presentation. Agreed. Lord Ashford bowed slightly. You have our cooperation, Duke Blackthorn, and our respect. What you accomplished wasn't just military victory, it was philosophical transformation. That matters more than territory or titles. The formal audience concluded with agreements and commitments. But the real impact came after, when young heirs approached Lucian individually. They wanted to understand, wanted to learn, wanted to know how someone transformed from feared tyrant to purpose-driven leader without losing effectiveness. Lucien found himself answering questions he'd never expected to address. How do you lead without fear? You find something worth protecting and you demonstrate through action that you'll sacrifice for it. People follow sacrifice. They respect it more than threats. How do you know when to yield versus when to stand firm? You don't. You calculate best you can and accept that sometimes you'll be wrong. The key is being wrong less often than you're right and learning from failures instead of denying them. How do you rebuild after losing everything? One decision at a time. One day at a time. One person at a time. You can't reconstruct entire frameworks instantly. You build small. You build true. You let it grow organically rather than forcing structure that collapses under its own rigidity. The conversation stretched through afternoon into evening. By the time the noble families departed, something had shifted in the northern territories. Not revolution, evolution. The kind that happened when people saw alternative to inherited systems and chose possibility over certainty. After they left, Lucien stood with Serafina watching the sun set over the northern sea. That wasn't what I expected, he admitted. I thought they'd come to challenge or demand explanations defensively. Instead, they came seeking partnership, because you showed them something they'd been afraid to hope for. Serafina leaned against him. You proved that changing approach doesn't mean losing effectiveness, that vulnerability and strength aren't opposites, that leaders can be human without becoming weak. She glanced up at him. That's radical in a world that teaches power requires emotional amputation. I'm still learning how to do human. Lucian's arm wrapped around her. 8 years of performance doesn't disappear overnight. I still calculate, still assess threats, still see patterns and potential betrayals. That doesn't go away. You just add other considerations alongside it. Serafina's voice carried understanding. You're not becoming weak. You're becoming complete. There's difference. Complete. Another word that felt foreign, like learning new language late in life when linguistic patterns were already established. But maybe that was the point. Maybe transformation required maintaining useful parts while adding previously rejected dimensions. Calculation plus empathy. Strength plus vulnerability. Purpose plus connection. Not weakness. Complexity. His father had understood that, had governed with both strength and compassion, had built loyalty through inspiring something beyond fear, then died for it. That's what haunted Lucian still, that his father's approach, however admirable, had been fatally vulnerable, that trust and openness had created the opening assassins exploited, that maybe he'd been right all along and this entire evolution was just extended suicide dressed as growth. Serafina sensed the thought, saw it in the tension returning to his shoulders. You're thinking about your father. Lucian nodded slowly, thinking about how his philosophy got him killed, how trust made him vulnerable, how everything I'm embracing now is what destroyed him, or saved him. Serafina turned to face him fully. Your father died protecting something he loved, died trying to build something worth existing for. That's tragedy, yes, but it's also meaning. It's purpose. She held his gaze. You survived 8 years through fear and isolation. Were you actually living during that time? Or just existing with better security? The question landed like blade between ribs, because she was right. Those 8 years of absolute control had been survival. But had he actually lived? Actually felt anything beyond constant vigilance? Actually connected to anything beyond strategic positioning? No. He'd been alive biologically while dead in every way that mattered. Going through motions, performing role, existing rather than living. His father had lived, really lived, felt deeply, connected completely, then died protecting those connections. Maybe that trade was acceptable. Maybe 40 years of authentic existence beat 80 years of protected isolation. Maybe the point wasn't surviving longest, but mattering most while time lasted. Maybe his father had been right all along, and Lucien had spent 8 years proving philosophy backwards. The realization hurt, sharp and deep, but also liberating in a strange way. Because if his father was right, then the last weeks hadn't been catastrophic failure of discipline. They'd been overdue awakening. They'd been returning to human values his father modeled before terror overwrote them. I spent 8 years angry at him. Lucian spoke quietly, angry that he trusted, that he opened himself to betrayal, that he died for values I considered naive weakness. His voice cracked slightly. I was wrong. He wasn't weak. He was brave. Braver than I've been until now. Because vulnerability requires more courage than fear ever did. Serafina's hand found his face. Gentle. Grounding. He'd be proud of what you've become. What you're building. The courage it took to abandon philosophy that kept you safe and embrace one that requires constant risk. Would he? Lucien's eyes reflected dying sunlight and old grief. Or would he be disappointed it took me 8 years and catastrophic loss to learn lessons? He tried teaching through example. Both, probably. Because that's what parents do. Be proud and disappointed simultaneously. Love you despite your failings and hope you'll exceed them. Her smile carried sad understanding. You'll never know for certain, so you choose what to believe and live accordingly. I choose to believe he'd understand, that the fear was necessary for survival long enough to reach a place where growth became possible. That timing matters, and I wasn't ready for these lessons at 19. Lucien looked out at darkening horizon. But I'm ready now. Ready to build something worth the sacrifice, worth the risk, worth actually living for instead of just surviving through. The commitment settled like foundation, like beginning rather than ending. They returned inside as full darkness claimed the fortress. The great hall was being cleared and cleaned, preparing for tomorrow, for whatever came next, for future that remained uncertain but felt possible in ways yesterday never had. Dmitri found them in the corridor. Your Grace, Lady Serafina. His formal tone carried something else. Warmth. Respect earned rather than enforced. The northern families left gifts, food, supplies, letters of support. He paused. They also left combat-ready soldiers, 24 from various houses, volunteered to supplement our depleted forces. Lucien stopped walking. They sent reinforcements? Without being asked? They want to invest in what you're building. Dmitri's scarred face showed something like hope. Want their people learning this new approach. Want to be part of transformation rather than casualties of it. That's significant. Serafina understood implications immediately. That's nobles recognizing they benefit from your success. That cooperation serves them better than competition. It's unprecedented. Dmitri agreed. But then again, most of what happened lately qualifies as unprecedented. True. Lucien absorbed this development. House the new soldiers with our veterans. Mixed integration. We learn from each other rather than maintaining separate cultures. And Dmitri, make sure they understand this isn't traditional military hierarchy. We're building something different. If they can't adapt, they can return home without shame. Understood, Your Grace. Dmitri saluted and departed. Lucien continued toward his private quarters with Serafina beside him. The tower that had been sanctuary and prison both. The space where everything had transformed from calculated protection to desperate connection. They entered the room where Marcus had betrayed him, where Montvale had died, where the final confrontation had revealed whether love was fatal weakness or necessary strength. Blood had been cleaned from floors, bodies removed, but memory remained, stained the space with ghost weight that cleaning couldn't eliminate. Serafina sensed his tension. We can take different quarters. Move somewhere without these associations. No. Lucien moved to the window overlooking the sea. This room witnessed transformation, saw the Iron Duke die and something else emerge. Moving away feels like denial, like pretending the cost wasn't real. Some costs deserve acknowledgement rather than constant reminder. Maybe. But I need to remember, need to see this space and recall what price came with choosing vulnerability over control. Lucien turned to face her. Because that memory keeps me honest, keeps me from backsliding into comfortable isolation when connection gets difficult. Serafina crossed to him. Her hands found his shoulders. Gentle pressure. You're afraid you'll revert, return to fear-based governance when stress increases. Every day. Lucien admitted what he'd been carrying. Old patterns are carved deep. 8 years of reflexive control. 8 years of seeing betrayal in every uncertainty. That doesn't just disappear because I decided different approach was preferable. It lurks, waiting for moment of weakness where reverting feels easier than growing. So you stay vigilant against yourself. Fight your own worst impulses. That's exhausting, Serafina's voice carried understanding, but also necessary. That's what growth costs. Constant attention, constant choice, constant recommitment to becoming rather than accepting. How do you know this? Because I watched my father do it. Watched him choose truth over comfortable lies every day despite cost. Despite it making his life harder. Her eyes reflected old pain. He could have been like other nobles. Could have smiled and lied and survived comfortably. Instead, he investigated injustice and died for it. But he died as himself, fully himself. That mattered to him more than safety. Lucien pulled her close, understanding settling deeper. They'd both lost fathers to violence. Both learned from men who chose principle over survival. Both carried weight of that legacy. Your father would be proud too, of what you've become, of how you refuse to let fear make you small. Lucien spoke against her hair. You're braver than anyone gives you credit for, including yourself. We're brave together, Serafina corrected. Separately, we're just damaged people with trust issues. Together, we're something functional enough to matter. The assessment made him laugh. Short and genuine. First real laughter in weeks. That's the most unromantic description of relationship I've ever heard. Good. Romance is performance. What we have is real. She looked up at him. Real is messy, complicated, difficult, but also sustainable, because it doesn't require maintaining illusions that collapse under pressure. Real over romantic. Lucian considered. I can work with that. They stood together at the window watching the sea, watching waves crash against cliffs that had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more. Persistent, enduring, shaped by what struck them but never eliminated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow always did. Nobles would test boundaries. Soldiers would need leadership. Territory would require governance that balanced old structures with new philosophies. But tonight they stood in a room where transformation had occurred at terrible cost and understood that. Sometimes the hardest battles were ones fought against comfortable darkness rather than obvious enemies. Lucien had spent 8 years in that darkness, had built empire of fear and called it strength, had eliminated every vulnerability and called it wisdom. Now he stood in light that hurt precisely because it revealed how much he'd been missing, how much life he'd avoided living, how much humanity he'd sacrificed for security that proved illusory anyway. The Iron Duke was dead, really dead, not coming back, not lurking beneath surface waiting to reclaim control. What remained was just Lucien, scarred, uncertain, learning how to exist without armor that had become prison. It was terrifying, liberating, necessary, and standing beside a woman who'd challenged everything he'd believed and proven that some things were worth every risk. He understood his father's final lesson. Love wasn't weakness that invited destruction. Love was the only thing strong enough to make destruction bearable, the only thing that gave surviving any purpose beyond mere continuation. His father had died protecting what he loved, had considered that trait acceptable, had gone into death with meaning rather than empty survival. Lucien had spent 8 years considering that philosophy fatal error. Now he understood it as only truth worth building life upon. Whether that meant he'd live 40 more years or die tomorrow, at least he'd spend remaining time actually living rather than merely surviving. Actually connecting rather than calculating. Actually mattering to something beyond maintenance of power structures that served no purpose except their own continuation. That was legacy. That was meaning. That was human in ways fear-based governance could never approximate. The Northern Territories would transform, slowly, gradually, with resistance and backsliding and moments where reverting to comfortable tyranny seemed easier than sustained growth. But Lucien would lead them forward anyway, would model vulnerability alongside strength, would demonstrate that leaders could be human without becoming weak, would prove through daily choice that purpose mattered more than power. Because 183 men had died buying him chance to learn those lessons, had followed him through impossible odds because he finally fought for something beyond tactical advantage. He owed them success, owed them transformation that justified sacrifice, owed them proof that what they'd died protecting actually mattered. And standing in fortress reclaimed at terrible cost, with woman who'd become home in ways stone walls never could, Lucien Blackthorne made quiet promise to ghosts and future both. The Iron Duke was dead. Long live the human trying to govern wisely while remaining fallible. Long live the philosophy that acknowledged fear and chose connection anyway. Long live the understanding that surviving without purpose was just slower dying. He would build something worth their sacrifice, would create territory that valued people over power, would demonstrate that leadership evolved when courage exceeded comfort, or he would die trying. And if he died, at least he'd die as his father did, protecting something that mattered rather than surviving in isolation that served no purpose except avoiding risk. Either outcome was acceptable, because meaning outweighed safety, purpose exceeded survival. Living completely beat existing indefinitely. Those were truths his father understood. Truths Lucien spent 8 years denying. Truths he would spend however many years remained proving through action rather than just words. The storm would come again. Storms always did. New threats, new betrayals, new tests of whether transformation was genuine or just temporary posture that collapsed under pressure. But when that storm arrived, Lucien would face it differently. Not alone, not isolated, not protected by fear that kept everyone distant. He would face it with Serafina beside him, with soldiers who followed purpose rather than coercion, with nobles who invested in cooperation because shared success beat competitive destruction. He would face it as human rather than weapon, and if that made him vulnerable, so be it. Vulnerability was just another word for having something worth protecting. And after 8 years of protecting nothing except his own continued survival, having something that actually mattered felt like waking from nightmare into morning, that hurt precisely because it was real. The sea crashed against cliffs below, eternal, persistent, real. And Duke Lucian Blackthorn, former Iron Duke, current uncertain leader trying to govern wisely while remaining fallible human, stood with the woman who taught him that sometimes weakness was just courage wearing different armor. Together they watched the stars emerge above northern territory that would transform or fail, but would at least try toward something better than comfortable tyranny. And in that attempt, in that daily choice toward purpose over power, in that sustained commitment to remaining human despite costs, they found something worth every sacrifice, every risk, every moment of vulnerability that made surviving feel like actual living. The Iron Duke had governed through fear and survived 8 years while essentially dead. Lucian Blackthorn would govern through purpose and live however many years remained as something approximating human. The difference mattered, made all the difference, made everything that came before worth enduring and everything that came after worth building toward. Spring would follow winter, always had, always would. And when it arrived, Blackthorn Keep would stand different but standing, transformed but enduring, human but strong. That was legacy. That was meaning. That was truth worth dying for and reason worth living. And as darkness claimed the fortress and stars emerged above the northern sea, two people who'd survived impossible odds stood together, understanding that sometimes the bravest thing humans could do was choose connection despite knowing it made them vulnerable, choose love despite knowing it made them mortal, choose purpose despite knowing it made them responsible, choose meaning despite knowing it made them accountable. Those choices defined humanity, separated existing from living, made surviving worth the effort. And if the cost was carrying weight that isolation never demanded, that was acceptable price for mattering in ways isolation never could. The Iron Duke was dead. Long live the man who learned that living beat surviving, that love beat fear, that purpose beat power. Long live the transformation purchased through blood and maintained through daily choice toward better versions of who humans could become when courage exceeded comfort. Long live the understanding that sometimes the strongest thing someone could do was admit they'd been wrong, embrace what that meant, and build something different from ruins of philosophy that kept them alive but never let them live. That was Lucian Blackthorn's truth now, hard-won, constantly tested, never certain, but real in ways 8 years of calculated control never approximated, and standing at window overlooking territory he'd protect until breath failed. With woman he'd die for beside him and future wide open before them both, he understood his father's final gift. Some things were worth the risk. Some connections were worth the vulnerability. Some purposes were worth the mortality they demanded. And living fully, even briefly, beat surviving endlessly while essentially dead. That was truth. That was wisdom. That was legacy. And that was enough.